The forest breathed around her, ancient pines standing sentinel in the gathering dusk. Eleanor ran barefoot across the forest floor, her movements swift and precise despite the exhaustion that burned through her muscles. 3 days without rest. 3 days of constant pursuit. Still she pushed on her tall frame, ducking beneath low-hanging branches, vaulting over fallen logs with inhuman grace. Behind her, the sounds of pursuit grew louder. Men on horseback, their voices carrying through the trees like wolves on a scent. The thud of hooves against packed earth. The jangle of metal guns and chains alike. Eleanor's lungs burned as she crested a small rise, the ground suddenly falling away before her. A ravine stretched below, at least 20 feet across the bottom, lost in shadow. She skidded to a halt, loose stones tumbling into the darkness. The sounds of her pursuers grew closer. No time to find another way. Drawing a deep breath, Eleanor backed up several paces. Then she ran, her powerful legs driving her forward until she launched herself across the chasm. For a moment, she hung suspended in airtime, seeming to slow as she crossed the void. Then she landed on the far side, rolling to absorb the impact, coming up in a defensive crouch. "There she is!" a voice shouted from the tree line. Two riders broke through the foliage, rifles raised. One wore a bowler hat, the other a dirty bandana across his face. The first fired his bullet, kicking up dirt inches from Eleanor's foot. She moved with blinding speed, snatching up a rock and hurling it with deadly accuracy. It struck the shooter square in the face, knocking him backward off his horse. In the moment of confusion, she charged the second rider, leaping up to grab his rifle barrel, using her momentum to yank him from the saddle. The man hit the ground with a dull thud, the air rushing from his lungs. Eleanor turned to grab the reins of his horse, her escape within reach. Then a high-pitched whine cut through the air, a sound so piercing it seemed to drill directly into her skull. Eleanor's knees buckled as pain exploded behind her eyes. She clawed at her ears, but the sound burrowed deeper, bypassing her senses to reach something implanted within her. 3 more riders emerged from the trees. In the lead, a man in an immaculate gray suit and polished boots, entirely out of place in this wilderness. He held a small silver device in his gloved hand, his thumb pressing down on a central button. His expression was one of clinical detachment as he watched Eleanor writhe on the ground. "Enough games, subject E8, he said, his voice carrying a hint of Boston refinement. "It's time to come home." Darkness closed in around Eleanor's visions, a world narrowing to a single point of agony before collapsing entirely. The auction block at Redemption Springs wasn't meant for people. It had been built for cattle and horses, rough-hewn timber, stained dark with years of animal sweat and blood. But today, as the sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty square, it held a different kind of merchandise. Samuel Hayes stood at the back of the crowd, hat pulled low over his eyes. He hadn't come for the auction. He'd come for supplies, grain, ammunition, maybe a new plow, blade if Miller's General Store had one in stock. The auction was just noise to him, background chatter, as he waited for the midday heat to break. "Next up," the auctioneer called, his voice carrying across the square, "we got ourselves a woman, good for housework, cooking, whatever you need." He winked and a ripple of laughter spread through the crowd of men. Hayes shifted uncomfortably. Slave trading was illegal these days, but out here, far from federal marshals and proper courts, they called it labor contracting or domestic placement. The law was whatever men with guns said it was. "Got this one from up north," the auctioneer continued, gesturing to his right. "Bit wild if I'm honest with you boys, but nothing a firm hand can't fix." A woman was led onto the platform, heavy iron chains around her ankles. Hayes's breath caught in his throat. She was tall, taller than most men in the crowd, with a mane of auburn hair pulled back in a tight braid. Her skin was sun-darkened, her forearms corded with lean muscle. But it was her eyes that held Hayes frozen in place, gray as storm clouds focused on some distant point beyond the crowd, refusing to acknowledge the men staring up at her. "Now I'll be straight with you," the auctioneer said, lowering his voice conspiratorially. "She ain't exactly a gal made for company. Stood down 2 marshals last week when they tried to feed her. Broke a man's arm with a broom handle." He rubbed his jaw where a faint bruise was visible. "She's strong as an ox, though. Good for farm work if you can handle her." The crowd shifted, men exchanging glances. Nobody stepped forward. "Starting bid at $50, the auctioneer called. Silence. "40 then," more silence punctuated by a few derisive snorts. Come on now, gentlemen. 30. She's worth more than that just for the work she can do. Hayes didn't know what made him raise his hand. Maybe it was the way she stood chin up despite the chains. Maybe it was the memory of another time, another place where he'd been too late to stop something terrible. Or maybe it was just that nobody deserved to be sold like livestock, especially not someone who so clearly refused to be broken. 30, Usty, he said, his voice rough from disuse. A ripple of laughter spread through the crowd. Someone muttered, Hayes finally looking for company out at that godforsaken ranch of his. The auctioneer blinked in surprise. 30 from Samuel Hayes, he announced, looking around hopefully. Do I hear 35 by him? No one moved. She ain't exactly a gal made for company, the auctioneer hedged again, as if trying to warn Hayes away from a bad investment. Might be more trouble than she's worth. 40 then, Hayes said flatly, just wanting it to be over. The woman's eyes snapped to his for the first time, sharp and assessing. Not grateful, but curious. Something twitched at the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile. Not yet. Sold, the auctioneer muttered, to Samuel Hayes of Stillwater Ranch. The crowd dispersed already, losing interest, moving on to the next item up for auction, a pair of Mauves. Hayes stepped forward, pulling money from his pocket. The transaction was completed with minimal words, the auctioneer handing over a folded piece of paper that supposedly transferred ownership. Hayes pocketed the paper without looking at it and approached the woman. Up close, he could see a thin scar running along her jawline, and smaller ones crisscrossing her forearms like a map of old battles. He knelt and unlocked the chain himself, unwilling to let anyone else handle her like cargo. You got a name, he asked quietly. Her eyes met his unflinching. Eleanor, she said simply. He didn't answer, just handed her the boots they'd taken from her. She pulled them on without thanks, then stood waiting, neither subservient nor defiant, just present. Hayes nodded toward the street. I've got supplies to pick up. Then we ride. They left Redemption Springs before dusk. Hayes's wagon loaded with the supplies he'd come for, plus a few extras, a second blanket, a pair of trousers and shirts that might fit Eleanor some dried apples because they looked decent for once. Eleanor sat beside him on the wagon bench, eyes turned west toward the setting sun, watching the horizon like it might hold answers to questions she hadn't asked. They traveled in silence for nearly an hour before Hayes spoke. Ranch is about 20 miles out, nothing fancy. Been in my family 2 generations. Eleanor nodded but didn't reply. You'll sleep in the bunkhouse, not the main house, he added, feeling the need to establish boundaries. Used to have hands to fill it, but it's just me now. Another nod, no change in her expression. Hayes glanced at her, trying to read something, anything in her profile. You don't talk much. Her eyes flicked to his briefly. Neither do you. A fair point. Hayes fell silent again, letting the steady clip-clop of the horses fill the space between them. The sun sank lower, painting the scrub land in shades of copper and gold. The air cooled slightly, bringing with it the scent of sage and dust. As the first stars appeared, pinpricks of silver in the darkening sky, Hayes found himself stealing glances at the woman beside him. The stranger he had just bought like a piece of furniture. What the hell had he been thinking? Eleanor caught him looking. Why'd you do it? She asked, voicing the very question in his mind. Hayes considered lying or brushing off the question. Instead, he found himself answering honestly. Don't rightly know. She studied him a moment longer, then looked back at the road. I killed the last one. Hayes's hands tightened on the reins. The last what? The last man who bought me. Her voice was matter-of-fact, as if she were commenting on the weather. They expected me to kill you too. It was the final test. Hayes kept his eyes on the road ahead, processing her words. Test for what? To see if their conditioning worked. If I would obey their programming, even after they sold me. She turned to look at him directly. But I won't kill you. That's reassuring. You look at me differently, she continued. Mo as a weapon, not as property, as a person. Her gaze returned to the horizon. I haven't seen that look in a very long time. Hayes had no response to that. They rode the rest of the way in silence, both considering what had just passed between them, a strange kind of trust born of honesty that might have terrified a lesser man. Stillwater Ranch appeared as they crested a low hill, a modest spread carved from unforgiving land. A small main house with a sagging porch, a weathered barn corral, in a bunkhouse off to the side. Not much to look at, but it was something Hayes had built with his own hands after returning from the war, when nothing else made sense but hard work and solitude. Eleanor took it all in silently as Hayes pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the barn. When he climbed down, she followed, standing with her hands loose at her sides, waiting for instruction. Hayes gestured toward the ranch in a sweep of his arm. Not much, but it's something. Barn their main house. Corrals need fixing. Chicken coop around back. He pointed to a small building off to the side. Bunkhouse, it's yours. Eleanor looked at the bunkhouse, then back at Hayes, a question in her eyes that she didn't voice. It's not a cage, Hayes said, understanding her hesitation. Door doesn't lock. He paused, searching for the right words. I don't own you. Paper says I do, but that's not worth the ink it's printed with. You work for me, I feed you, give you a place to sleep. That's the deal. You want to leave, that's your choice. Something shifted in Eleanor's expression. Not quite trust, but perhaps a lessening of suspicion. Why would you say that after paying good money? Hayes shrugged, suddenly uncomfortable. No man should own another. War taught me that much. He busied himself unhitching the horses, aware of her eyes still on him. There's a pump out back for washing. I'll bring those clothes over once I get the horses settled. Eleanor nodded and headed toward the bunkhouse, her stride long and sure, like she'd been walking this land for years instead of minutes. Hayes watched her go, struck by a strange feeling he couldn't quite name. For the first time since Nathaniel died, the ranch didn't feel so empty. The next morning, Hayes woke at dawn to find Eleanor already outside, inspecting the corral fence with a critical eye. She'd scrubbed herself clean at the pump, her hair still damp at the ends, and changed into the clothes he'd left outside her door, a faded blue shirt and tan trousers that somehow fit her tall frame better than he'd expected. Fence is rotting on the south side, she said when she noticed him watching. Won't hold anything stronger than a lazy mule. Hayes nodded, surprised by her assessment. Been meaning to fix that. I saw lumber by the barn. I can do it. It wasn't a question, but Hayes nodded anyway. Breakfast first, no point working hungry. In the kitchen, Hayes fried salt pork and eggs, sliced bread, and poured coffee thick enough to stand a spoon in. Eleanor ate like someone used to having food taken away efficiently, quickly, without pleasure or complaint. She took exactly half of what was offered, no more. There's plenty, Hayes said, pushing the pan toward her. Take what you need. Eleanor glanced up, then carefully took another piece of bread. Thank you. After breakfast, they fell into work like they'd been doing it together for years. Eleanor took to the fence repair, while Hayes tended to the horses and chickens. By midday, she'd replaced 3 rotting posts and secured the rails, working with a quiet competence that impressed him. At lunch, Hayes found himself talking more than he had in months, explaining the ranch. The spring that never ran dry, even in drought years, the north pasture that grew the best grass, the temperamental stove that needed sweet talking to light on cold mornings. Eleanor listened, asking occasional questions, practical ones, about water lines and predators and soil quality. Not once did she ask about his past, or why he lived alone out here, or what had happened to the hands who once filled the bunkhouse. It was a courtesy he returned, not questioning the scars on her arms or the way her eyes sometimes darted to the horizon, scanning for threats. By late afternoon, Eleanor had finished the fence and moved on to the corral, where Hayes kept a wild stallion he'd been trying to gentle for weeks. The animal would let no one near it, but somehow tolerated Eleanor standing by the fence, watching it with those storm-gray eyes. He won't let anyone touch him, Hayes said, coming to stand beside her. Tried everything, might have to sell him. Eleanor shook her head. He's not mean. He's afraid. Same thing out here. Afraid horse is dangerous. Only if you try to break them. Eleanor kept her eyes on the stallion, which had stopped pacing to watch them. Breaking things isn't the only way to make them useful. Hayes studied her profile, struck by the feeling she wasn't just talking about the horse. What's the alternative? Respect. She turned to look at him then, and something passed between them. An understanding, perhaps, or the beginning of one. Show him you're not a threat. Let him come to you. Hayes nodded slowly. Might take time. Some things do. The stallion approached the fence cautiously, nostrils flaring as it scented them. Eleanor remained perfectly still as it stretched its neck toward her ears, flicking forward, then back to sighting. Don't move, she murmured to Hayes. Let him choose. The stallion snorted, hot breath visible in the cooling evening air, then extended its muzzle until it nearly touched Eleanor's outstretched hand. For a long moment, they remained like that woman and beast in a silent negotiation of trust. Then the stallion pressed its nose into her palm, exhaling softly. Hayes watched mesmerized as Eleanor began to stroke the animal's face, her movements slow and deliberate. The stallion's eyes half closed in something like contentment. "How did you learn to do that?" Hayes asked quietly. Eleanor didn't take her eyes off the horse. "When people treat you like an animal long enough, you learn to understand them." The words hung in the air between them, filled with a history Hayes could only begin to imagine. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the yard, he found himself watching Eleanor more than the horse. There was something in the gentleness of her hands, the patience in her eyes that didn't match the image of a woman who claimed to have killed her previous owner. Who was she really, and what had been done to her that made her both so dangerous and so careful? That evening, they sat on the porch as darkness fell, the day's work done. Hayes had brought out 2 cups of coffee, handing one to Eleanor without asking if she wanted it. She accepted it with a nod, her eyes drawn to a distant hill where a simple wooden cross stood silhouetted against the deepening blue of the sky. "Who's buried there?" she asked, breaking the comfortable silence. Hayes followed her gaze, a familiar ache settling in his chest. "My brother, Nathaniel." "How did he die?" "Fell from the south ridge chasing a steer that broke loose. Rains had just come. Ground gave way." The words were mechanical, rehearsed from all the times he'd had to explain it to neighbors in distant relations. Eleanor let the silence stretch a beat. "You blame yourself." It wasn't a question. Hayes exhaled through his nose, looking out at the darkening land. "I was supposed to be there. I stayed behind to fix a fence." The irony wasn't lost on him. Another fence, another failure. The wind rustled the dry grass below the porch. "I don't think that's how blame works," Eleanor said softly. "Sometimes the land just takes who it wants." Hayes didn't respond, but he looked at her, then really looked. She was watching the horizon, jaw set, arms resting on her knees, like a soldier waiting for a war. And maybe that's what they were in now, a slow war, one built of threats and silences. "Thank you," he said finally, "for saying that." Eleanor nodded, and they returned to their comfortable silence as the first stars appeared overhead. No more words were needed as the night deepened around them, each lost in their own thoughts, yet somehow less alone than they had been that morning. The days fell into a pattern. Eleanor worked the ranch with a tireless efficiency that made Hayes wonder how any man could have seen her as fit only for domestic service. She repaired fences, tended livestock, and spent hours each day with the stallion, which was now allowing her to brush its coat and even place a light blanket on its back. Hayes found himself watching her more often than he cared to admit. The way she moved with quiet confidence around the ranch, how she seemed to know what needed doing without being told, the rare small smile that sometimes crossed her face when she thought no one was looking. They settled into a routine that felt strangely comfortable for 2 people carrying so many unspoken burdens. They ate meals together, worked side by side during the day, and in the evenings sometimes sat on the porch watching the sun sink behind the distant mountains. They didn't talk much during these times, but the silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was the silence of 2 people who understood that some wounds didn't need words to be acknowledged. The nightmare came as it always did, fragments of memory distorted by fear and time. Eleanor stood once again in a white room strapped to a metal table, the cold surface pressing against her back. Faces loomed above her, masked and distant, discussing her as if she weren't there. "Subject E8 shows remarkable resilience," a woman's voice said. "The enhancements have taken well, but the conditioning remains problematic." "She resists," a man replied, "like her mother." "The device will correct that." The woman moved closer, holding something that gleamed in the harsh light. "No mind can resist forever." The device descended toward Eleanor's head, wires and metal designed to burrow into her consciousness. She struggled against the restraints, muscles straining tendons, standing out like cords. "No," she gasped. "Not that, not again." Eleanor woke with a scream tearing from her throat, her body rigid with terror. For a moment, she didn't know where she was, the bunkhouse at Stillwater Ranch, fading in and out of focus as memories superimposed themselves over reality. The door burst open and a figure appeared silhouetted against the night sky. Eleanor reacted instinctively, launching herself from the bed with inhuman speed. She tackled the intruder hands, finding a throat, fingers digging in with terrible strength. Eleanor, a choked voice called. Eleanor, wake up! The voice penetrated the fog of her nightmare recognition dawning. Hayes. She was strangling Samuel Hayes. Eleanor released him instantly, scrambling backward until her back hit the wall, horror replacing fear on her face. I'm sorry, she gasped. I thought. Hayes rubbed his throat, breathing deeply. It's all right, he managed. My fault. Shouldn't have startled you. In the dim light filtering through the window, he could see Eleanor draw her knees up to her chest, making herself smaller than he'd ever seen her. Sweat plastered her hair to her forehead, her eyes wide and haunted. You were screaming, Hayes said, keeping his distance. Calling out about something called the device. Eleanor's hand went unconsciously to the back of her neck, tracing a ridge of scar tissue hidden beneath her hair. It's what they use to control us, she said, her voice hollow. When it's on, you're still in there somewhere deep inside, but you can't stop your body. You just watch while it does terrible things. Hayes tried to process what she was saying. It sounded impossible, like something from a dime novel. Yet the scars were real enough, and those eyes had seen things no one should have to see. Who are they? He asked quietly. They call themselves Phoenix. They don't just buy and sell people. They make them. Remake them. Eleanor's hand traced one of the scars on her arm through her sleeve. They wanted soldiers who wouldn't question orders, who wouldn't feel fear or pain or mercy. And they did that to you, Eleanor nodded. I was one of their subjects. Subject E8. The designation comes with the enhancements. Enhancements. She held up her hands, studying it as if it belonged to someone else. Stronger. Faster. I heal quickly. My senses are sharper than they should be. She looked up at him, her eyes reflecting the moonlight. I was born there. Created there. My mother was one of their first subjects. Hayes felt sick. He'd seen terrible things during the war, but this experimenting on people, on children, was a different kind of evil. You're safe here, he said, knowing it might be a lie. Even as he said it, Eleanor gave him a sad smile. No one's safe from them. Not really. She straightened, composing herself. You should go back to sleep. I'm fine now. Hayes hesitated, then nodded and stood. At the door, he paused. Eleanor. She looked up. Thank you for telling me. She nodded once, and Hayes stepped out into the night, his mind churning with questions and a growing sense of dread. As he crossed the yard back to the main house, Hayes found himself remembering things he'd long tried to forget. The war, his time as a scout behind enemy lines, and a particular mission late in the conflict, one that had never sat right with him. A prison camp in Georgia. He'd been sent to gather intelligence on rumors of Union soldiers being experimented on. What he'd found had been worse than anything his commanders had imagined. Not just soldiers, but civilians. Children in cages being injected with something that made them scream. He'd reported back, but by the time a force was sent, the place was empty, burned to the ground. Nothing left but ashes and the lingering smell of chemicals he couldn't identify. Hayes had tried to forget, had buried himself in the ranch and hard work. But Eleanor's words had dragged those memories back to the surface along with questions he'd never thought to ask. Who had been running those experiments? What had they been trying to achieve? And could there be a connection to this Phoenix organization? Eleanor spoke of. Hayes didn't sleep the rest of the night, sitting instead on his porch with a rifle across his knees, watching the darkness as if it might suddenly reveal enemies hidden within its depths. The following days brought a subtle change to Stillwater Ranch. Not in the work that continued as before with Eleanor proving her worth daily, but in the atmosphere between them. A new wariness in Eleanor's eyes when she looked at Hayes as if she regretted revealing so much of herself. A new vigilance in Hayes scanning the horizon more frequently, keeping his rifle closer at hand. They still ate meals together, still worked side by side, but the comfortable silence they had shared was now filled with unspoken questions and concerns. A week after Eleanor's nightmare, Hayes found her sitting cross-legged on the ground near the corral, carefully untangling the stallion's mane with her fingers. The animal stood calmly beside her, occasionally lowering its head to nudge her shoulder gently. He trusts you, Hayes said, keeping his distance to avoid startling the horse. Eleanor nodded without looking up. Trust isn't complicated. It's just knowing someone won't hurt you when they could. Hayes leaned against the fence, watching her work. Phoenix, he said, the word hanging in the air between them. I think I might have seen them before. During the war. Eleanor's hand stilled in the stallion's mane. What did you see? Hayes told her then about the prison camp in Georgia, the experiments, the children in cages. As he spoke, Eleanor's expression grew increasingly grim, her eyes darkening like storm clouds. The doctor, she said when he finished, was she tall, gray at the temples, gee, with a scar here? She traced a line along her right eyebrow. Hayes looked up sharply. Yes, how did you know? Margaret Hammond. She was there at the beginning of Phoenix. Eleanor's eyes held a haunted knowledge. She's still there, still experimenting. A chill that had nothing to do with the cooling evening air ran down Hayes's spine. The same woman after all these years. Eleanor nodded. Phoenix grew out of those early experiments. They found backing rich men who wanted weapons that couldn't be traced back to governments. Men like Reed. Harrison Reed. He'll come for me eventually. Eleanor's face was resolute. They never let their subjects go, especially not the successful ones. What makes you successful? Hayes asked, then immediately regretted the question. It sounded as if he were evaluating her worth like those she'd escaped. But Eleanor didn't seem offended. I survived the enhancements without losing my mind. I'm stronger and faster than most of their subjects. A ghost of a smile touched her lips. And I'm too wild to be properly conditioned. That's what they wrote in my file. Hayes found himself returning her smile, albeit grimly. Good, let's keep it that way. The stallion snorted as if in agreement, and Eleanor resumed her careful untangling of its mane. Hayes watched for a moment longer before heading back to the house, his mind working through what he'd learned. If Phoenix had roots going back to the war, to that prison camp in Georgia, then what Eleanor had told him about being born into their program could be true, which meant they'd been operating with impunity for decades, taking children, experimenting on them, turning them into weapons. And somehow, by terrible coincidence, one of their subjects had ended up at his ranch. Or was it coincidence that the thought struck Hayes like a physical blow? What if Eleanor had been sent here? What if her story of killing her previous owner was a lie, a cover for some deeper mission? He dismissed the thought almost as soon as it formed. The terror in her eyes during that nightmare had been real. The way she gentled the stallion, the care she took with the smallest tasks around the ranch, these weren't the actions of someone playing a role. Still, her presence had changed everything. The peaceful isolation Hayes had built for himself was shattered, replaced by a growing sense that his ranch was now a target. That Phoenix, whatever it was, would eventually come looking for their lost property. And when they did, Hayes would be ready. 3 weeks passed without incident. The fence was repaired, the garden weeded and expanded, the chicken coop reinforced against foxes. Eleanor continued to work with the stallion, spending hours each day, just standing near it, talking in a low voice Hayes couldn't quite hear from a distance. By the end of the 3rd week, she was not only brushing its coat, but had managed to place a saddle on its back. The animal still trembled at the unfamiliar weight, but no longer showed the whites of its eyes or tried to bolt. You've done what I couldn't in months, Hayes said one evening as they sat on the porch watching the stallion graze peacefully in the corral. Eleanor shrugged. You were trying to break him. I just showed him another way. Is that what Phoenix tried to do to you? Break you? She was quiet for a long moment, her eyes on the horizon where the sun was setting in a blaze of red and gold. Yes, she said finally, but like your stallion, I wasn't made for breaking. Hayes nodded, understanding more than he could say. After the war, he'd known men who broke, who came home with bodies intact, but minds shattered by what they'd seen and done. He'd felt himself cracking too until he found this land, this ranch, this purpose. My brother, he said suddenly, the words surprising him as much as they might have surprised Eleanor. Nathaniel, he wasn't just chasing a stray steer when he died. Eleanor turned to look at him, her expression attentive but not pressing. He'd been investigating disappearances, children from ranches in the area gone without a trace. Hayes stared out at the darkening land, seeing not the present but the past. Everyone said they'd run off or been taken by Indians or fallen into abandoned mine shafts. But Nathaniel didn't believe it, said there were too many too close together. When was this? Eleanor asked quietly. 5 years ago. Hayes's hands tightened on the arms of his chair. I didn't pay much attention to his theories, was too busy with the ranch with my own problems. Then he fell from that ridge and everyone said it was an accident. But you don't think it was? Hayes shook his head slowly. I didn't let myself think about it at all. Not until you came and started talking about Phoenix taking children. Eleanor was silent, processing his words, her face unreadable in the gathering darkness. Finally, she spoke. If Phoenix was operating in this area, taking children for their program, and your brother was getting close to discovering them, then his death was no accident, Hayes finished. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Eleanor reached across the space between their chairs and briefly touched his hand, the first time she had initiated contact since that night in the bunkhouse. I'm sorry, she said simply. Hayes nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. After a moment, Eleanor withdrew her hand and they sat in silence as the stars emerged one by one in the velvet darkness above. The man came at noon when the sun was highest and there were no shadows in which to hide. Hayes saw the dust from the approaching buggy, first a plume rising from the eastern trail. He was repairing a shed roof, but climbed down immediately, hand going to the pistol at his hip. Eleanor, he called, not taking his eyes off the approaching vehicle. She appeared from the barn, saw his stance, and followed his gaze to the dust cloud. Without a word, she moved to stand slightly behind him, a position that might look deferential to a visitor, but gave her a clear view and room to move if needed. The buggy that pulled up to the ranch was black and polished to a high shine, pulled by a matching pair of sleek bay horses, too fine for these parts, where practicality trumped appearance. The man who stepped down was similarly out of place, tall, slender, dressed in an immaculate gray suit with a silk vest and white gloves despite the heat. His black hat was brushed free of dust, and a gold watch chain glinted across his chest. Mr. Hayes, I presume, he called, his accent refined, possibly Boston or New York. Hayes didn't move from his position on the porch. That's right, you're a long way from wherever you came from, mister. The man smiled, revealing perfect white teeth. Harrison Reed at your service. He removed his hat in a gesture of politeness that felt rehearsed. It's been some time, Sergeant Hayes. Hayes stiffened to recognition dawning. Reed, Supply Corps, Army of the Potomac. You remember, I'm flattered. Reed's eyes shifted to Eleanor, a spark of something cold and calculating in their depths. And I see you've acquired something of mine. I don't recall buying anything from you, Hayes said evenly. Not from me, Mr. Hayes. Something that belongs to me. His gaze fixed on Eleanor. Subject E8, as I believe you know her. Her name is Eleanor, Hayes said, his voice hardening, and she's not property. I beg to differ. Reed reached into his coat and withdrew a folded document. I have papers properly signed and notarized. She was sold to me by the Phoenix Corporation as part of a private transaction. The man who auctioned her had no right to do so, as she was already spoken for. Hayes didn't take the offered paper. She's not yours. She was sold to me. A clerical error, I assure you, Reed replied, smile still in place but eyes growing cold. I have the paperwork. Then you have a problem. The smile finally dropped from Reed's face. You don't understand what you're dealing with, Hayes. She's not just a woman. She was born a Project Phoenix subject, created not born for a specific purpose. Eleanor stepped forward, eyes blazing. I was born free, she said, each word deliberate as a knife thrust. And I'll die that way. Reed laughed, a sound devoid of humor. Free, you were designed in a laboratory E8. Your mother was a test subject your conception monitored and modified. You've been Phoenix property since before your first heartbeat. Hayes saw Eleanor flinch, a tiny motion that betrayed how deeply Reed's words had cut. The last I checked, Hayes said, drawing Reed's attention back to him, the 13th Amendment abolished slavery. Regardless of her origins, Eleanor is a person, not property, and she's staying here of her own free will. Reed's expression hardened. You always were self-righteous, Hayes, even during the war. He replaced his hat carefully. I'll be back with men who fix problems. His eyes flickered to Eleanor. And I'll be bringing the device. See how much free will she has then. As the buggy pulled away, Hayes turned to Eleanor. Her face was expressionless, but her eyes were focused on the retreating vehicle with an intensity that spoke volumes. You knew him, she said, not a question. Hayes nodded. Logistics officer during the war. Always had what the officers needed. Good boots, fine liquor, cigars. Never knew where he got it all. Never asked. He studied her face. What did he mean about your mother being a test subject? Eleanor's jaw tightened. Just what he said. My mother was taken early in the program. They modified her, then used her to create more subjects. She met his eyes. I told you they'd come. Hayes nodded, looking back at the dust trail left by the buggy. Then we better get ready. They worked through the rest of the day and into the night, preparing the ranch for what was coming. Eleanor seemed to know instinctively what to do, positioning lanterns around the corral to create false signals for anyone approaching in the dark, oiling the hinges on the back gate so it wouldn't creak, moving the horses to the far pasture where they'd be safe from crossfire. Hayes brought out weapons from a long-forgotten chest beneath the floorboards in the main house, 2 pistols, a shotgun, and a small leather pouch that he stared at a moment too long before tucking it away again. Eleanor didn't ask what was in it. As they worked, a strange calmness settled over Hayes. The anxiety that had been building since Eleanor's arrival, the fear of Phoenix's return, it all crystallized into a cold determination. If Reed wanted a fight, he'd get one. But beneath that determination ran a current of something else concern for Eleanor. Not just for her safety, but for what Reed's words had revealed about her origins. Created, not born, a test subject from conception. What did that do to a person's sense of self? As if sensing his thoughts, Eleanor paused in her work, straightening to her full height. What he said doesn't change anything, she said quietly. My mother may have been their subject, but she was still my mother. She named me. She held me when they would let her. She loved me enough to teach me to resist them. Hayes nodded, respecting her need to assert her humanity. What happened to her? She died when I was 8. Eleanor's voice was flat, but her eyes betrayed her pain. They said her heart gave out. But I think she chose to go. It was the one freedom they couldn't take from her. Hayes wanted to offer comfort, but didn't know how. Instead, he simply said, she'd be proud of you. Eleanor looked surprised, then thoughtful. I hope so, she said finally. Then straightening her shoulders, she returned to her preparations. The brief moment of vulnerability passed. By midnight, they had done all they could. The ranch was as secure as they could make it, with sightlines cleared and defensive positions established. They stood beside the dying embers of the fire, checking their preparations one last time. Get some rest, Hayes told Eleanor. I'll take first watch. Eleanor hesitated, then reached out and briefly touched his arm the second time she'd initiated contact, a gesture that seemed to cost her something. Wake me in 4 hours. You need rest too. As she walked toward the bunkhouse, Hayes found himself watching her go, struck by the strange twist of fate that had brought her to his door, and the even stranger feeling that he'd do whatever it took to keep her there safe and free. The nightmare was different this time. Hayes stood once again in that Georgia clearing, the prison camp before him, screams echoing from within its walls. But this time, as he crept closer, the faces pressed against the barred windows were familiar. Nathaniel, his brother, mouth open in a silent plea for help, and beside him, Eleanor younger, her eyes vacant with suffering. He ran toward them, but the distance seemed to stretch endlessly. When he finally reached the building, the door was locked, a heavy padlock securing it. He fired his rifle at it again and again, but the lock wouldn't break. Help us, Nathaniel called. Samuel, please. Then a hand fell on his shoulder and he turned to find himself face to face with the gray-templed doctor, her smile cold as she held out a key. You've already helped us, Sergeant Hayes, she said. Don't you remember? The scene shifted and suddenly Hayes was in uniform, standing guard outside a tent while muffled screams came from within. He was guarding the tent, he realized with horror, protecting the torturers, not their victims. No, he whispered. That's not what happened. But even as he denied it, doubt crept in. There had been a mission late in the war where he'd been assigned to guard a medical research unit. He'd been told they were developing treatments for battlefield injuries, vaccines for diseases that ravaged the camps. He'd never looked inside the tents, never questioned the strange equipment they transported, or why they needed so many restraints. Hayes. The voice came from far away, cutting through the nightmare's grip. Hayes, wake up. You're dreaming. He jolted awake with a gasp, hand automatically reaching for a weapon that wasn't there. Eleanor stood beside the chair where he had fallen asleep during his watch, her face concerned in the dim light of the dying fire. You were calling out, she said. Your brother's name. Hayes sat up, rubbing his face with shaking hands. Sorry, he muttered. Old ghosts. Eleanor nodded, understanding without needing details. The storm's passed, she said, nodding toward the window where pre-dawn light was just beginning to soften the darkness. Hayes looked at her in confusion. Storm, there will be, she said, tapping her temple. Pressure's dropping. I can feel it, a big one's coming. Hayes studied her face, remembering what she'd said about enhancements. Another Phoenix improvement. She nodded. Useful for a weapon that needs to anticipate battlefield conditions. There was bitterness in her voice, but also a strange pride. We should secure the ranch before it hits. They spent the morning preparing for the approaching storm, bringing vulnerable livestock into the barn, checking that the roof patches they'd applied would hold, gathering extra firewood in case the storm lasted days. As they worked, Hayes found himself watching Eleanor more closely, seeing her in a new light after Reed's revelation about her origins. Was she truly created in a laboratory designed from conception to be a weapon? The idea seemed impossible, like something from a fantastical novel. And yet he had seen her strength, her reflexes, the way she healed faster than any person should. Eleanor caught him staring as she easily lifted a heavy feed trough that would have taken two men to move. "Does it bother you?" she asked, her voice neutral. "Knowing what I am." Hayes considered his answer carefully. "I've known what you are since you first arrived," he said finally. "A woman trying to be free. Nothing Reed said changes that." Something softened in Eleanor's expression, not quite a smile, but a lessening of the tension that had been there since Reed's visit. She nodded once, then returned to her work. By midday, the sky had darkened to a bruised purple clouds building into towering thunderheads. The air grew thick and heavy, pressing down on the land like a weight. Animals grew restless, horses nickering in the barn, chickens huddled in the coop. Even the wild stallion, now in a stall for safety, paced along the fence line, tossing its head at the gathering storm. "Going to be a bad one," Hayes observed as they made a final check of the property. Eleanor nodded, her face turned to the darkening sky. "Lightning's already starting about 5 miles out. Can you hear it?" Hayes strained his ears, but heard nothing. "No. Enhanced hearing," she explained. "Sometimes a curse more than a blessing." The first fat raindrops began to fall, quickly building to a downpour. They retreated to the main house, both soaked from their final checks around the property. Thunder rumbled in the distance, growing closer with each passing minute. "Might be a long one," Hayes said, stoking the fire in the stove. "These summer storms can last days sometimes." Eleanor stood by the window watching the rain come down in sheets, her expression distant. Lightning flashed, illuminating her face in stark white light, and for a moment she looked like something from another world, ancient and otherworldly despite her youth. "What are you thinking?" Hayes asked, struck by her stillness. "That I've never watched a storm from inside before." She turned to him, a sad smile touching her lips. "At Phoenix, they used to put us outside during storms to build endurance," they said, "to make us unafraid of nature's fury." Hayes felt a familiar anger rise in his chest, the same helpless rage he'd experienced during the war, watching atrocities he couldn't prevent. "They had no right," he said quietly. "No," Eleanor agreed. "They didn't." Another flash of lightning followed almost immediately by a deafening crack of thunder. The lights flickered, then steadied. "You can stay in here tonight," Hayes said. "Bunkhouse roof might leak." Eleanor hesitated, then nodded. "Thank you." The storm intensified as night fell, rain lashing against the windows in horizontal sheets, wind howling around the eaves like a living thing seeking entry. They ate a simple dinner by lamplight, beans, cornbread, and coffee, then sat in companionable silence, the earlier tension between them eased by the shared work of the day. "What was it like?" Eleanor asked, suddenly breaking the quiet. "The war." Hayes's knife stilled on the piece of wood he was whittling. No one had asked him that in years, not directly. Most folks either assumed they knew or had the decency not to pry. "Hell," he answered simply. "A hell we made ourselves." Eleanor nodded, accepting his sparse answer without pushing. But something in her silent acceptance made Hayes want to continue to share the burden he'd carried alone for so long. "I was a scout," he said, eyes on the wood in his hands. "Union Army. Spent most of my time behind enemy lines gathering intelligence, sometimes helping runaway slaves reach Union territory." His voice grew distant. "Saw things no man should see, things that stay with you." Lightning flashed again, throwing strange shadows across the room. "There was this prison camp in Georgia." Hayes continued, the words coming unbidden now. "We'd heard rumors, Union soldiers being experimented on, treated worse than animals. I was sent to confirm." His hands tightened on the knife. "But it wasn't just soldiers. There were children there too. Kids in cages being injected with something, screaming." Eleanor had gone very still, her sewing forgotten in her lap. I reported back, but by the time a force was sent, the place was empty, burned to the ground. Hayes set down his whittling, suddenly weary. Sometimes I still hear those screams in my dreams. The doctor, Eleanor said softly. Was she tall, gray at the temples, with a scar here? She traced a line along her right eyebrow. Yes, Hayes said, looking up sharply. How did you know Dr. Margaret Hammond? She was guided by Mr. Reed. Eleanor's eyes held a haunted knowledge. She's still there, still experimenting. A chill that had nothing to do with the storm ran down Hayes's spine. The same woman after all these years. Eleanor nodded. Phoenix grew out of those early experiments. They found backing rich men who wanted weapons that couldn't be traced back to governments. Men like Reed. Thunder boomed directly overhead, rattling the windows in their frames. The lamp flickered, throwing their faces into momentary darkness before steadying again. I should have stopped it. Hayes said, the old guilt rising like bile in his throat. Back then, when I first saw it, should have done something. What could you have done alone? Eleanor asked gently. They would have killed you, and nothing would have changed. Maybe, or maybe those children wouldn't have suffered. Hayes looked up, meeting her eyes. Maybe you wouldn't have been born into captivity. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. Then she set aside her sewing and moved to sit beside him on the worn sofa. You can't change what happened, she said. But you're helping now. That matters. Something in her voice, in the quiet certainty of her words, eased a knot in Hayes's chest that had been tight for decades. He looked at her, really looked, and saw not just the weapon Phoenix had tried to create, but the woman who had emerged despite everything, strong, compassionate, and fiercely determined to choose her own path. That Georgia camp, Eleanor said after a moment. It was the beginning. Hammond believed that human potential could be enhanced through scientific intervention. The war gave her the opportunity to experiment without oversight. Hayes nodded slowly. And after the war, she found private backers, created Phoenix. Eleanor's face hardened. They started with orphan street children, those no one would miss. But as the program expanded, they became bolder. They staged accidents, created false orphanages, even bought children from desperate families under the guise of apprenticeship programs. And no one stopped them. Hayes couldn't keep the disbelief from his voice. People tried. Eleanor's eyes were distant, remembering. There were investigations sometimes, but Phoenix would burn the evidence, move the operation, change names. And they had powerful protectors, men who saw the potential value in having access to human weapons that couldn't be traced back to them. Hayes thought of Nathaniel, of his investigation into missing children. Had he gotten too close to Phoenix, discovered something that made him a threat? Your brother, Eleanor said, as if reading his thoughts. You said he was looking into missing children 5 years ago. That would have been around the time Phoenix established a new facility in this region. Where? Hayes asked, his voice sharp. I don't know exactly. I was kept at their main compound in Colorado. Eleanor's brow furrowed in concentration. But I heard them mention outposts. Marrow Gap was one, and Ashlock Ridge. Hayes straightened, recognition flashing across his face. Marrow Gap is an old mining settlement about 3 days' ride west of here. Been abandoned for years. And Ashlock Ridge, he frowned. There's nothing there but an old railroad depot. That's probably it. They often use transportation hubs as fronts. Eleanor's eyes met his, a silent understanding passing between them. If your brother was investigating missing children and those places are nearby, then he might have discovered Phoenix's operation, Hayes finished, and they killed him for it. The implications hung heavy in the air between them, punctuated by another crash of thunder that seemed to shake the very foundations of the house. Outside, the storm raged on a mirror to the turmoil within. Hayes stood abruptly, crossing to a cabinet near the fireplace. From inside, he withdrew a leather-bound journal, its pages worn and dog-eared. Nathaniel's notes, he said, returning to sit beside Eleanor. I never read them all. It was too painful after he died. Together they pored over the journal, Hayes translating his brother's cramped handwriting in shorthand. Nathaniel had documented at least 7 children who had disappeared from ranches and small settlements within a 50-mile radius. He'd noted patterns that all the children were between 8 and 12 years old, all physically strong and healthy, all taken without witnesses. On the final pages, Nathaniel had written about investigating an abandoned mine near Marrow Gap, where locals reported seeing lights at night and hearing strange sounds. The last entry, dated just 3 days before his death, contained a single line: "Found something. Need to tell Sam." He never had the chance. Hayes closed the journal, his hands trembling slightly. "He knew," he said quietly, "and they killed him for it." Eleanor placed her hand over his, a gesture of comfort that seemed to surprise them both. "I'm sorry," she said simply. They sat like that for a long moment, the storm raging outside while a different kind of tempest built within Hayes' grief, transforming into resolve, guilt, hardening into determination. "We're going to find them," he said finally, his voice steady despite the emotion churning beneath. "Phoenix, we're going to expose what they've done, make them pay for Nathaniel, for you, for all of it." Eleanor studied his face, her expression grave. "They're powerful, Hayes, connected, protected. I don't care." His eyes met hers, burning with a fierce intensity. "Will you help me?" Eleanor didn't hesitate. "Yes," she said, "but you should know, once we start this, they'll never stop hunting us. Not until they've silenced us or we've destroyed them." Hayes nodded, accepting the risk. "Then we better make sure we destroy them first." Outside, the storm began to ease, the thunder growing more distant, the rain softening from a deluge to a gentle patter against the windows. But within the house, a new storm was brewing, one that would soon break over Phoenix with a fury they could never have anticipated. Hayes jolted awake, heart hammering against his ribs. The dream clung to him like cobwebs, ghostly fingers trailing across his consciousness. He'd been back in Georgia, but this time it wasn't just nameless children in those cages. It was Nathaniel and a younger Eleanor, both reaching for him through the bars, both calling his name. As the gray-templed doctor, Hammond smiled coldly. "You've already helped us, Sergeant Hayes," she had said. "Don't you remember?" And then the dream had shifted, and he was in uniform, standing guard outside a tent, while muffled screams came from within. He was guarding the tent, he realized with horror, protecting the torturers, not their victims. Hayes sat up, running a hand through his sweat-dampened hair. The dream had left him shaken, not just because of its content, but because of the seed of truth it contained. He had been assigned to guard a medical research unit late in the war. He had been told they were developing treatments for battlefield injuries, vaccines for diseases that ravaged the camps. He had never looked inside the tents, never questioned the strange equipment they transported, or why they needed so many restraints. Had he been guarding the very people who would go on to create Phoenix? Had his inaction, his unquestioning obedience, allowed Hammond to continue her terrible work? The thought was unbearable. Hayes rose from the sofa where he had fallen asleep after their long conversation. Eleanor was nowhere to be seen. A moment of panic gripped him. Had she left before he spotted movement through the window? She was outside, sitting on the porch steps, head tilted back to look at the stars now visible in the clearing sky. He joined her, the boards of the porch still wet from the night's deluge. The air smelled clean and new petrichor rising from the soaked earth as the first birds began to call tentatively from distant trees. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, sitting beside her. Eleanor shook her head. "Too much to think about." They sat in silence for a moment, both looking up at the vast expanse of stars, wheeling overhead in a sky that suddenly seemed both full of possibility and heavy with approaching danger. "I was there," Hayes said abruptly. "I guarded them. The doctors at that camp in Georgia. I never went inside, never saw what they were doing, but I was there. I helped them even if I didn't know it." Eleanor turned to look at him, her expression unreadable in the darkness. "Did you know what they were doing?" "No, but I should have asked questions, should have looked closer." "Hayes," Eleanor's voice was gentle but firm, "you were a soldier following orders. You couldn't have known." He shook his head, unable to accept her absolution. "That's what men always say to excuse the inexcusable. I was just following orders. But there comes a point where that's not enough." "Yes," Eleanor agreed. "And you reached that point. You reported what you saw. You tried to stop it." She placed a hand on his arm. "The guilt you feel, that's what separates you from them. Hammond and Reed and the others, they don't feel guilt. They believe in what they're doing. They think they're creating a better world." Hayes looked at her, struck by the wisdom in her words. "How did you stay human?" he asked quietly. "After everything they did to you?" Eleanor was silent for a long moment, considering the question. "My mother," she said finally. "She told me stories when the guards weren't listening. Stories about the outside world, about freedom, about what it meant to be human. She taught me that what makes us human isn't our bodies or our abilities, it's our choices. Our capacity to love, to show mercy, to resist cruelty. She sounds remarkable. She was. Eleanor's voice softened with memory. She never gave up hope that I would escape someday, that I would find a life beyond Phoenix's walls. A small smile touched her lips. I think she would have liked your ranch. Hayes felt a warmth spread through his chest at her words. I think she would have been proud of the woman you've become. Eleanor ducked her head, unused to such praise, but Hayes could see the impact of his words in the way her shoulders straightened, in the subtle lift of her chin. As the sky began to lighten with the first hints of dawn, they sat together in companionable silence, each lost in thought, yet somehow less alone than before. The shared confidences of the night had forged a new bond between them, a connection built on mutual understanding and respect. Eventually, Eleanor stood, stretching muscles stiff from sitting. We should check the ranch for storm damage, she said, practical as always. Hayes nodded, rising to join her. As they walked side by side across the yard, he felt a resolve solidifying within him. Whatever came next, Phoenix Reed, the reckoning for Nathaniel's death, they would face it together. They spent the morning assessing the storm's impact on the ranch. A few fence posts down, some shingles torn from the barn roof, a fallen tree blocking one of the pasture gates, nothing that couldn't be repaired with a day's work. By noon, the sun had burned away the last of the clouds, turning the rain-soaked land into a steaming mirror that reflected the harsh blue of the sky. Hayes and Eleanor worked side by side, repairing what the storm had damaged, their movements falling into an easy rhythm born of growing familiarity. As Eleanor helped Hayes lift a heavy roof beam back into place, she suddenly tensed her head, turning sharply eastward. What is it? Hayes asked, recognizing the alertness in her posture. Smoke, she said, her enhanced senses detecting what he could not yet perceive. From the east, not a campfire too big, too deliberate. Hayes strained his eyes in the direction she indicated. After a moment, he spotted it, a thin plume of dark smoke rising against the lightening sky. About 10 miles, he estimated, near the old Hamilton place. Eleanor nodded. Deliberately said, I'd guess. Too big for an accident. They exchanged a look, both thinking the same thing: Reed had returned, or someone connected to him. This was a message: we're close. We're watching. We're coming. I'll ride out, Hayes said. See what happened. We'll ride out, Eleanor corrected, her tone leaving no room for argument. Together. By the time they'd saddled the horses, Eleanor on the now gentled stallion, which seemed to trust her implicitly, the smoke had thinned but was still visible, a smudge against the morning sky. They rode in silence, alert for any sign of ambush or surveillance. But the land seemed empty, washed clean by the storm. As they approached the source of the smoke, an acrid smell of burned wood and something else, something chemical and sharp, filled the air. The Hamilton place had been abandoned for years, the old man who owned it killed in a flash flood while trying to save his cattle. What remained was a small homestead, a modest cabin, a barn, and a corral, all showing years of neglect. Or rather, what had remained. Now there was only charred timber and ash where the cabin had stood still, smoldering, despite the night's rain. The barn was partially intact, its stone foundation holding the firm, while the wooden upper structure had collapsed inward. They dismounted a safe distance away, approaching cautiously on foot, Hayes with his rifle ready, Eleanor scanning the surroundings with alert eyes. Nobody here, Eleanor said after a moment. Not for hours. How can you tell? She tapped her nose. Enhanced senses. I can smell when humans have been present recently. Whoever did this is long gone. They moved closer to the ruins, careful of hot spots still glowing among the ashes. It had been a thorough job. Nothing left to salvage the fire hot enough to warp metal and turn glass to twisted pools. This wasn't just to destroy the place, Eleanor said, crouching to examine something in the ash. It was to cover something up. She brushed aside a layer of soot to reveal what looked like a metal hatch, partially melted, but still recognizable. There was a cellar or something deeper. Hayes joined her, helping to clear more debris. The hatch was secured with a heavy padlock that had fused shut in the heat. He used the butt of his rifle to break it, the metal crumbling after several solid blows. Together, they pulled the hatch open, revealing a set of stairs descending into darkness. A dank, institutional smell wafted up antiseptic and mildew, and something else, something that made Eleanor take an involuntary step back. You know that smell? Hayes asked, noting her reaction. She nodded, her face grim. Phoenix. Their labs all smell like that. Her eyes met his hard with determination, despite the fear he could see beneath it. This was one of their outposts. Hayes struck a match, lighting a small lantern they'd brought. "Stay behind me," he said, though he suspected Eleanor was far better equipped to handle whatever waited below than he was. The stairs led to a narrow corridor, concrete-walled and clinically bare. Doors opened off either side, small rooms with metal frame beds bolted to the floor, each equipped with restraints. Most were empty, but in one dark stains marked the thin mattress in patterns Hayes didn't want to interpret. At the end of the corridor was a larger room, clearly a laboratory of some kind, metal tables, equipment Hayes didn't recognize, cabinets with glass doors revealing rows of bottles and instruments. Everything was in disarray, as if someone had hastily gathered what they could before setting the fire. Drawers hung open, cabinets stood empty, wires dangled from where equipment had been ripped out. Eleanor moved through the space like a ghost, touching nothing, her face a mask of controlled emotion. She stopped at one of the metal tables, running a finger along its edge. "I was on a table like this," she said softly, "the first time they put the device on me." Hayes wanted to comfort her, but didn't know how. What words could possibly address such a violation? He focused instead on searching for anything that might tell them why this place had been here so close to his ranch, and why it had been destroyed now. In a partially burned filing cabinet, he found a single folder that had survived the fire, its edges charred, but its contents mostly intact. Inside were photographs and handwritten notes, clinical observations of subjects identified only by numbers. And then he saw a photograph that made his blood run cold. A group of men in uniform stood before a nondescript building, and among them, younger but unmistakable, was Hayes himself. He stared at the image, trying to make sense of it. He recognized the setting, now a research facility he'd been assigned to guard late in the war. They'd told him it was a medical unit developing treatments for wounded soldiers. He'd believed them. He'd never looked inside. But the banner hanging above the door in the photograph bore a symbol he now recognized, a stylized phoenix rising from flames. Eleanor's voice seemed to come from far away. "What is it?" He couldn't speak, couldn't tear his eyes from the damning evidence in his hands. He'd been part of it, unknowingly, unwillingly, but part of it nonetheless. He'd guarded the very people who had gone on to create the organization that had tortured Eleanor and countless others. "I didn't know," he whispered. "I swear I didn't know." Eleanor took the photograph from his trembling hands, studied it, then looked up at him with eyes that held no accusation, only understanding. "Of course you didn't," she said simply. "They're masters of deception. That's how they've survived so long." Her forgiveness, offered so readily when he couldn't even forgive himself, broke something open inside him. Hayes turned away, unable to bear the weight of her gaze. "We should go," he said roughly. "There's nothing more to learn here." As they climbed back into the sunlight, Hayes felt as though he was emerging from more than just an underground bunker. He was coming out of a darkness he hadn't even known he carried, a complicity that had shadowed him for decades without his knowledge. They rode back to the ranch in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. It was only as they crested the final hill, the buildings of Stillwater Ranch visible in the distance, that Eleanor spoke. "It wasn't your fault," she said. "What they did, what they became, that's not on you." Hayes didn't answer immediately, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "Maybe not," he said finally, "but stopping them is." The boy appeared 3 nights later, as suddenly as if he'd been conjured from the darkness itself. Hayes heard the chickens first, their alarms squawking, pulling him from a restless sleep. He grabbed his rifle and stepped onto the porch, expecting to see a fawn or coyote trying to raid the henhouse. Instead, he found a small figure huddled against the chicken coop, too weak even to stand. A boy no more than 12 or 13, his clothes torn and filthy, his back striped with what could only be whip marks visible through the shredded fabric. Hayes crossed the yard in 3 strides, kneeling beside the child. The boy was alive, but barely, his pulse thready, his skin clammy, his breathing shallow and pained. When Hayes gently rolled him over, he saw a face stretched gaunt with hunger and exhaustion. And something else, a haunted look no child should ever wear. "Eleanor," Hayes called, gathering the boy carefully in his arms. "Eleanor, come quick." She emerged from the bunkhouse instantly, as if she hadn't been sleeping at all. One look at what Hayes carried, and she was running toward the house, reaching it before him, to throw open the door and clear the table with one sweep of her arm. "Put him here," she commanded, already reaching for the medical kit they kept on a high shelf. Hayes laid the boy down as gently as possible, but even that light contact made him whimper in pain. Up close, the wounds on his back were even worse, deep lacerations, some infected, others crusted with dirt and dried blood. And on his arms, familiar scars of patterns that matched Eleanor's own. They worked in grim silence, Eleanor cleaning the wounds with a steady hand, while Hayes heated water and tore clean sheets into bandages. The boy never fully woke, drifting in and out of consciousness, occasionally muttering words that made no sense. Numbers, codes, fragments of what sounded like military commands. When they had done all they could, Eleanor sat back, her face drawn with fatigue and something deeper, recognition perhaps, or painful memory. "He's from Phoenix," she said quietly. "The scars are the same. Newer version, but the same concept." Hayes nodded. He'd suspected as much from the moment he saw the marks on the boy's arms. Why would they do this to a child? Children are easier to condition, more adaptable. Eleanor's voice was flat, clinical, as if distancing herself from the horror of what she was describing. Their brains form new pathways more readily, and they don't have as many memories to erase. She reached out gently, brushing the boy's hair back from his forehead. The gesture was unexpectedly tender from someone who had known so little kindness herself. "He escaped," she continued, "and they punished him for it. These aren't just discipline marks. They're systematic, designed to cause maximum pain without permanent damage to a valuable asset." The clinical terminology contrasted sharply with the compassion in her touch, and Hayes realized she was quoting what had been said about her own punishments. His hands curled into fists at his sides. "We'll keep him safe," he promised, though he wasn't entirely sure how they could protect one small boy from an organization powerful enough to operate with impunity for decades. Eleanor looked up, her eyes meeting his with fierce determination. "Yes," she said, "we will." They moved the boy to Hayes's bed, taking turns watching over him through what remained of the night. By morning, his fever had broken, but he remained deeply unconscious, his body healing in the profound sleep of the utterly exhausted. It was 3 more days before he finally opened his eyes. Eleanor was sitting beside the bed, whittling a small figure from a piece of pine on a skill she'd picked up, watching Hayes on the porch in the evenings. The boy's eyes fixed on her, widening in recognition. "You're the giant," he whispered, his voice raspy from disuse. Eleanor looked up, her knife stilling. "And you're the ghost." A faint smile touched the boy's cracked lips. "My name's Gabriel. I'm 17D. I'm Eleanor." "You're the giant," Gabriel whispered, his voice raspy from disuse. Eleanor looked up, her knife stilling. "And you're the ghost." A faint smile touched the boy's cracked lips. "My name's Gabriel. I'm 17D. I'm Eleanor, E8. She set aside her carving. "You're safe here, Gabriel. This is Samuel Hayes's ranch. You're far from Phoenix now." The boy's eyes darted around the room, taking in the simple furnishings, the sunlight slanting through the window, the distant sounds of chickens and horses. "They'll come for me," he said, fear creeping into his voice. "They always do." "Let them try," Eleanor said with quiet ferocity. Hayes entered, then carrying a tray with broth and bread. He set it down when he saw the boy was awake, approaching the bed slowly so as not to frighten him. "Welcome back to the land of the living," he said gently. "You gave us quite a scare." Gabriel studied him warily. "Are you Phoenix too?" "No." Hayes shook his head firmly. "We're about as far from Phoenix as you can get." The boy seemed to relax slightly at that. "They said the giant was dead," he told Eleanor, "that she failed the final test and was terminated." "They lied?" Eleanor replied. "They do that a lot." Gabriel nodded, accepting this as a fundamental truth. "I ran because they were going to put the device on me," he said, his hand unconsciously moving to the back of his neck. "I wasn't ready," they said. "Not conditioned enough. But I saw what it did to the others." His voice dropped to a whisper. "It makes you not you anymore." Eleanor nodded, her expression grave. "I know." "Can I stay here?" Gabriel asked, looking between them with a vulnerability that belied the horrors he must have witnessed. "Just for a little while." "You can stay as long as you need," Hayes assured him. "This is a safe place." The boy didn't seem entirely convinced, but he accepted the broth when Eleanor held it to his lips, too weak yet to feed himself. "Thank you," he whispered. As he drank, Hayes noticed a small mark on his shoulder, partially hidden by the loose shirt they'd put on him, a tattoo or brand, a tiny phoenix symbol with a number beneath it, 17D. Something about the mark triggered a memory Nathaniel in the last letter he'd sent before his death, describing strange markings he'd seen on children who'd gone missing from ranches in the area. Children he'd been trying to find and help. Hayes's heart began to pound. Nathaniel hadn't died in an accident. He'd been killed because he discovered Phoenix's operations nearby because he tried to stop them. Gabriel, he said carefully, the place you escaped from. Where is it? The boy hesitated, fear flickering across his face. You don't have to tell us if you're not ready, Eleanor interjected, shooting Hayes a warning look. You're safe here, that's all that matters for now. But Gabriel shook his head, a determination beyond his years, hardening his features. No, you should know so you can be ready when they come. He took a deep breath. It's called Morrow Gap, old mining camp about 3 days' ride west of here. That's where they train us. Make us run through the canyon. If you stop, he shuddered, they fire into the air the first time. Then they aim lower. Hayes and Eleanor exchanged a glance, both recognizing the name. Morrow Gap was indeed an abandoned mining settlement one Hayes had passed on cattle drives years back. He'd never stopped there. Something about the place had always felt unwelcoming, though he'd attributed it to the desolation of a town that had died when the silver played out. There's a bigger place too, Gabriel continued. Ashlock Ridge. That's where they took some of us when the device worked, said we were ready for the next phase. Ashlock Ridge, Eleanor repeated the name clearly unfamiliar to her. Where is that east, near the ridge lines that look like broken teeth? There's a train depot hidden under a warehouse. Gabriel's eyes grew distant. That's where they moved us by rail in boxes like cargo. Hayes felt sick, imagining children packed into crates, shipped like animals to be experimented on. How long had this been happening right under everyone's noses? How many children had disappeared over the years? Their absences explained away as runaways or victims of the harsh frontier. You're very brave, Gabriel, he said, resting a gentle hand on the boy's shoulder. And you've helped us more than you know. Gabriel looked up at him, a fragile hope in his eyes. Are you going to stop them? Hayes met Eleanor's gaze over the boy's head, seeing in her eyes the same resolve he felt building in his chest. Yes, he said, we are. That night, after Gabriel had fallen back asleep, Hayes and Eleanor sat on the porch, the darkness around them seeming deeper, somehow more filled with hidden threats now that they knew what lurked in the shadows of their world. Nathaniel knew, Hayes said quietly, breaking the silence that had stretched between them. My brother, the missing children, the Phoenix operation nearby, he was investigating it before he died. Eleanor turned to him, understanding dawning in her eyes. You think they killed him, it wasn't a question, but Hayes nodded anyway. Made it look like an accident, a fall from the ridge while chasing a steer. His hands tightened on the arms of his chair. I never questioned it, never looked deeper. If I had, you might be dead too, Eleanor said bluntly. And then where would Gabriel be? Where would I be? Her practical perspective cut through his spiral of guilt, as it often did. Hayes exhaled slowly, forcing his grip to relax. We need a plan, he said. Phoenix is too big to take on directly, but if we can gather evidence, find witnesses. We need to go to Morrow Gap, Eleanor said. See what's left there, then Ashlock Ridge. Hayes nodded slowly. It's dangerous. They'll be watching for Gabriel. And you. I know. Eleanor's face was resolute in the dim light from the house windows. But I'm tired of running Hayes. Tired of letting them control my life from a distance. She looked toward the room where Gabriel slept, then back at Hayes. And I won't let them do to him what they did to me. Hayes studied her profile, the proud line of her jaw, the determination in her eyes, the quiet strength that had drawn him to her from the first moment on that auction block. In the weeks since she'd arrived at Stillwater Ranch, she'd become more than just a woman he'd saved or a partner in running the ranch. She'd become essential, a presence he couldn't imagine being without. The realization hit him with unexpected force. He cared for her deeply, completely, in a way he hadn't cared for anyone since before the war had hollowed him out. We'll leave day after tomorrow, he decided. Give Gabriel another day to rest. He can stay here with... He paused, realizing the flaw in his plan. There was no one else at the ranch, no one they could trust with the boy's safety. He comes with us, Eleanor said. He knows the place, and he'll be safer with us than alone here. Hayes wanted to argue, but knew she was right. They couldn't leave Gabriel behind, not when Phoenix might return at any moment. All right, he agreed. We'll all go, but we move carefully. Observe before acting. This isn't just about finding evidence anymore. It's about keeping that boy safe and making sure whoever killed Nathaniel pays for it. Eleanor nodded, her expression solemn. Then unexpectedly, she reached across the space between their chairs and took his hand, her fingers warm and calloused against his. Whatever happens, she said quietly, I'm glad the world brought me to your door, Samuel Hayes. He curled his fingers around hers, a wordless acknowledgement of all that had passed between them and all that might yet come. They sat like that for a time, hands joined and watching the stars wheel overhead in a sky that suddenly seemed both vast with possibility and heavy with approaching storm. Gabriel grew stronger by the hour, youth and resilience, perhaps enhanced by whatever Phoenix had done to him, working in his favor. He still tired easily and walked with a slight limp from a half-healed wound on his calf, but his eyes were clear and his mind sharp. Eleanor spent time with the boy, drawing out his story in gentle fragments that wouldn't overwhelm him. What emerged was a picture of systematic cruelty disguised as scientific progress. Children taken from orphanages or purchased from desperate families, subjected to enhancements similar to Eleanor's own, then conditioned through a combination of punishment and reward to follow orders without question. The device is the final step, Gabriel explained, as they sat in the shade of the porch, his thin fingers tracing patterns in the dust. It connects to your brain somehow, makes you obey completely. But you resisted it, Eleanor said. Gabriel nodded. They said I wasn't responding right to the preliminary conditioning, that I might be like you. Wild-type resistant, they called it. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. They were afraid of what I'd do if the device didn't control me properly. And what would you have done? Hayes asked, pausing in his task of checking the saddle cinches. The boy met his eyes steadily. Run, he said simply, which is what I did anyway. Eleanor smiled, ruffling his hair in a gesture of affection that seemed to surprise them both. Smart boy. As they prepared for their journey, Hayes watched the interaction between Eleanor and Gabriel with a growing warmth in his chest. Despite everything Phoenix had done to them, they retained an essential humanity, a capacity for kindness and connection that no amount of conditioning could erase. It gave him hope that they could overcome whatever lay ahead. By evening, they were ready. The ranch was secured as best they could manage livestock, moved to the far pasture with enough food and water to last a week, valuables hid in the house locked up tight, if they didn't return. But that was a thought Hayes refused to entertain. They would return. They had to. They would leave at first light, following the old mine road west toward Morrow Gap. From there, they would decide their next move based on what they found. Hayes had sent a letter to Mason, a former comrade, and now a local judge, explaining some of what they had discovered and their suspicions about Nathaniel's death. If they didn't return within 2 weeks, Mason would know to investigate. That night, unable to sleep, Hayes stood at the window of his room, now temporarily. Gabriel's watching the boy's chest rise and fall in the peaceful rhythm of deep slumber. How many children like him were still in Phoenix's grip? How many had been lost already to their experiments and conditioning? A soft step behind him announced Eleanor's presence before she spoke. He's stronger than he looks, she said quietly, coming to stand beside Hayes at the window. He survived. That says a lot. So did you, Hayes replied. Eleanor was silent for a moment, her eyes on the sleeping child. I had help, she said finally. Someone who saw me as a person, not a weapon or a tool. Hayes turned to look at her, finding her much closer than he'd realized. In the dim light, her eyes were shadows, but he could feel the weight of her gaze on him. Eleanor, he began, not sure what he wanted to say, but feeling the need to say something to acknowledge the current that had been building between them. She shook her head slightly, stopping him. Not now, she said softly. Not yet. When this is over, when we're free of them, completely. She left the thought unfinished, but the promise in it hung in the air between them. Hayes nodded, understanding. There would be time later for whatever this was becoming. First, they had a mission to complete, a boy to protect and justice to seek. Get some rest, he said. Long ride tomorrow. Eleanor smiled, a quick flash in the darkness, then turned to go. At the door, she paused, looking back over her shoulder. Hayes, whatever happens out there, I choose this. Remember that. Before he could respond, she was gone, leaving him with the weight of her words and the growing certainty that whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. Not because fate or circumstance had thrown them together, but because they had chosen each other in a world that had tried to deny them both the right to choose it all. They left Stillwater Ranch as the first light of dawn broke over the eastern hills, casting long shadows across the land. Three riders on a mission none of them had sought, but all had embraced Hayes on his steady bay gelding, Eleanor on the once wild stallion that now followed her commands with quiet trust, and Gabriel on a gentle mare chosen for her smooth gait and calm temperament. The boy sat tall in the saddle despite his recent injuries, his face set in lines of determination too old for his years. He led the way, pointing out landmarks only he could recognize from his desperate flight to freedom. There, he said, indicating a distant rock formation shaped like a howling wolf. That's Wolf's Head. We're on the right track. They rode in watchful silence, alert for any sign of pursuit or surveillance. Eleanor constantly scanned the horizon, her enhanced senses searching for threats Hayes and Gabriel might miss. Occasionally, she would signal a halt, listening to something beyond normal hearing, then nod and continue when satisfied they remained alone. The land grew wilder as they traveled west, scrub giving way to pine forest. In the higher elevations, the air cooler and scented with resin. Game trails crisscrossed their path, but they saw a few signs of human habitation: an abandoned trapper's cabin, the remnants of an old mining claim, a weather-beaten shrine left by Mexican travelers to some forgotten saint. By midday, they had covered significant ground, the horses maintaining a steady pace that balanced speed with endurance. They stopped in the shade of a towering pine to rest and water the animals, sharing a simple meal of jerky, hard bread, and dried apples. How much farther? Hayes asked, studying the crude map they had sketched based on Gabriel's recollections. We'll reach Marrow Gap by tomorrow afternoon, if we keep this pace, the boy replied, tracing their route with a stick in the dirt. There's a ridge we need to cross first, then a canyon that leads straight to it. Eleanor was unusually quiet, her gaze distant as she slowly ate. When Gabriel moved away to check on the horses, Hayes shifted closer to her. What is it? He asked softly. She met his eyes, her own troubled. I've been here before, she said. Not Marrow Gap specifically, but these woods. I remember running through them being hunted. She gestured to a scar on her forearm. That's where they caught me the last time I escaped before they decided to sell me. Hayes resisted the urge to reach for her hands, sensing she needed space with these difficult memories. You made it out, he reminded her. For good this time. A ghost of a smile touched her lips. Yes, but coming back here, she shook her head. It feels like walking back into a cage willingly. Not willingly, Hayes corrected. Purposefully. That's different. Eleanor considered this, then nodded slowly. You're right. Her eyes met his, something unspoken passing between them. And this time I'm not alone. The moment was broken by Gabriel's return. Riders, he said urgently, coming fast from the east. Eleanor was on her feet, instantly moving to a vantage point where she could see back along their trail. Hayes followed, hand dropping to his rifle. In the distance, dust rose from a group of horsemen, 6, maybe 7, moving at a gallop directly on their path. Phoenix, Hayes asked. Eleanor narrowed her eyes. Probably. Too deliberate to be random travelers. How did they find us so quickly? Gabriel's voice trembled slightly, the brave facade cracking to reveal the frightened child beneath. Eleanor looked down at him, her expression softening. They've been watching the ranch, she said, waiting for us to make a move. She turned to Hayes. We need to split up. No, Hayes said firmly. We stay together. They'll catch all of us if we do. I can lead them away, buy you time to reach Marrow Gap. Her eyes held his, resolute. I'm faster, stronger. I can outrun them or fight if I have to. Hayes wanted to argue, but the tactical part of his mind, the scout who had survived behind enemy lines for years, recognized the logic in her plan. Still, the thought of Eleanor facing Phoenix alone made his chest tight with fear. Where will you meet us? He asked, accepting the inevitable. Marrow Gap. Hide in the old mine shaft on the western edge. I'll find you. She was already moving to her horse, checking the saddle cinches. Take care of Gabriel. Before Hayes could respond, she leaned down and pulled Gabriel into a quick, fierce hug. Stay with Hayes, she told the boy. Do exactly as he says. I'll come back for you both. Gabriel nodded, tears welling in his eyes despite his efforts to appear brave. Promise? Promise. Eleanor straightened, then turned to Hayes. For a moment, he thought she might embrace him too, but instead she merely held his gaze. Be careful, she said softly. You too. She hesitated then, in a move that surprised them both. She leaned forward and pressed her lips briefly to his, a kiss so quick he might have imagined it, yet so real he could feel the warmth of it lingering after she pulled away. Before he could react, she swung into the saddle with fluid grace, the stallion dancing beneath her, sensing the tension in its rider. Head northwest through the pine grove, she instructed. It's denser there, harder to track. I'll circle around and lead them south. With a final nod, she wheeled the stallion and took off at a gallop, riding straight toward their pursuers for 100 yards before veering sharply south, making herself a clear and tempting target. Hayes watched her go, fighting every instinct that screamed at him to follow to protect her. But he had Gabriel to think of now, and the boy's safety had to come first. "Come on," he said, helping Gabriel onto his mare. "We need to move." They plunged into the pine forest, the dense undergrowth, slowing their pace but offering concealment. Behind them, distant shouts confirmed that Eleanor's diversion had worked. The pursuers were changing course, following her trail instead of continuing toward them. Hayes led them deeper into the forest, the dappled light filtering through the canopy, making it difficult to maintain a straight course. But he had been a scout in far more challenging terrain, and his sense of direction remained true northwest, always northwest toward Morrow Gap, and whatever answers awaited them there. As the day wore on, the sounds of pursuit faded entirely. Either Eleanor had successfully led their hunters far away, or Hayes refused to complete the thought. She was alive. She had to be. He would accept no other possibility. They made camp that night in a small hollow, risking only the smallest of fires to ward off the mountain chill. Gabriel huddled close to the meager flames, his young face drawn with exhaustion and worry. "Will she be okay?" he asked, voicing the question that had haunted Hayes all day. Hayes poked at the fire, watching sparks rise into the darkness. "Eleanor is the strongest person I've ever met," he said truthfully. "If anyone can outrun those men, it's her." Gabriel nodded, seeming to accept this. "She's like me," he said after a moment. "Different. They changed us both." "How so, Tom?" Hayes asked, curious about the boy's enhancements, but careful not to push too hard. Gabriel hesitated, then held out his hand, palm up. In the firelight, Hayes could see faint lines beneath the skin. Not scars like Eleanor's, but something deeper, like veins that followed unnatural patterns. "They put things in me," the boy explained. "Metal and other stuff. Said it would make me stronger, faster." He closed his hand into a fist. "And it did, but it hurts all the time." Hayes felt a familiar anger rise in his chest, the helpless rage at cruelty he couldn't prevent or undo. "I'm sorry, Gabriel." He said the words inadequate but sincere. Gabriel shrugged, an old gesture on young shoulders. "Not your fault. Besides, it's useful sometimes. I can feel when people are coming, like a buzzing in my head. That's how I knew about the riders today." Another piece of the puzzle fell into place: how the boy had managed to escape his pursuers and find his way to Stillwater Ranch. These enhancements had given him advantages his captors hadn't anticipated. "Try to get some sleep," Hayes said, pulling a blanket around Gabriel's shoulders. "I'll keep watch." The boy nodded, lying down close to the fire. Within minutes, his breathing had deepened into sleep, the exhaustion of their journey claiming him, despite his worries. Hayes leaned back against a tree trunk, rifle across his knees, eyes scanning the darkness beyond their small circle of light. Somewhere out there, Eleanor was running or hiding or fighting alone against men who saw her as property to be reclaimed. The thought made his hands tighten on the rifle until his knuckles whitened. "Be safe," he thought, sending the wish into the night like a prayer. "Come back to us, to me." Morning came with no sign of pursuit, for which Hayes was grateful. Gabriel awoke more refreshed, his resilience remarkable given all he had endured. They ate a cold breakfast, unwilling to risk a fire in daylight, then continued their journey toward Morrow Gap. The terrain grew more challenging as they ascended toward the ridge Gabriel had mentioned. The trees thinned, giving way to rocky slopes and narrow trails that forced them to dismount and lead the horses. By noon, they reached the crest, where a panoramic view opened before them, miles of wilderness stretching to the horizon, and nestled in a valley below the remains of what had once been a thriving mining town. "Morrow Gap," Gabriel said, his voice dropping to a whisper, as if the place might hear him. Even from a distance, Hayes could see why the settlement had been abandoned. The silver mine that had given it life had clearly played out, leaving behind a ghost town of weathered buildings and rusted equipment. But there was something else about it, something that sent a chill down his spine despite the midday heat. An emptiness. a stillness too complete for a place so recently occupied. "Something's wrong," he said quietly. "It's too quiet." Gabriel nodded, his eyes fixed on the town below. "They're gone," he said, sounding surprised. "Phoenix, they were always there before, at least guards." Hayes studied the settlement through his field glasses, noting details that wouldn't be apparent to the naked eye: doors left ajar, windows unshuttered, no smoke rising from any chimney. "Abandoned," he confirmed, "but recently, maybe within the last few days." They descended cautiously, leading the horses down a steep trail that wound its way to the canyon floor. As they approached, Marogap Hayes's unease grew. The town wasn't just abandoned, it had been evacuated in haste. Items left behind, doors standing open, a wagon half loaded with crates, and then left in the street. "Stay close," he told Gabriel, drawing his pistol. Something spooked them bad enough to leave in a hurry. They tied the horses in a stand of scrub pine where they would be hidden from casual observation, then made their way through the abandoned town. Up close, Marogap revealed its true nature: not just a mining camp, but something more sinister. The buildings nearest the canyon entrance appeared normal enough, if dilapidated. But as they moved deeper into the settlement, subtle differences became apparent. Windows too small and too high to see through, doors reinforced with metal bars, and everywhere, the phoenix symbol scratched or painted onto walls and posts, a silent claim of ownership. "This is where they watched us," Gabriel whispered, his voice tight with fear, as they passed what had once been the town square. "They'd bring us here from the compound, make us run through the canyon. If you stopped, they'd fire into the air. Then the next time they'd aim lower." Hayes placed a reassuring hand on the boy's shoulder, feeling the tremors running through his small frame. "It's okay," he said softly. "They're not here now, we are." They continued their exploration, finding the settlement eerily deserted. No guards, no personnel, not even tracks to suggest recent occupation. Either Phoenix had abandoned this outpost entirely, or they had withdrawn temporarily, perhaps in response to Gabriel's escape. As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, they made their way to the mine shaft Gabriel had identified. The entrance was larger than Hayes had expected, the timbers supporting it surprisingly solid given the apparent age of the settlement. "Let's get the horses and make camp inside," Hayes decided. "Better shelter and easier to defend if anyone comes." They retrieved the animals and led them into the mine shaft, which opened into a surprisingly spacious cavern just beyond the entrance. Old mining equipment lined the walls, and the remains of a track for ore carts ran along the floor, disappearing into darker tunnels beyond. Hayes built a small fire near the entrance where the smoke could escape without drawing too much attention. As darkness fell, the cavern took on an almost homey feel, the firelight casting dancing shadows on the rock walls, the horses' quiet movements, a reassuring background to their hushed conversation. "What if she doesn't come?" Gabriel asked, finally giving voice to the fear that had been growing all day. Hayes stoked the fire, buying time to compose his answer. "She will," he said firmly. "Eleanor keeps her promises." Gabriel wrapped his arms around his knees, making himself smaller. "But what if they caught her?" "Then we'll find her," Hayes replied, the steel in his voice leaving no room for doubt. "We don't leave people behind." The boy seemed comforted by the certainty and eventually dozed off, curled in his blanket near the fire. Hayes remained awake, alternating between watching the mine entrance and exploring the cavern, looking for any clues about Phoenix's operations here. In a side chamber, he found what appeared to be storage areas, empty crates with military markings broken, cages large enough to hold children, scattered papers, too water damaged to read. The evidence confirmed Gabriel's story. This had indeed been a Phoenix facility, though apparently abandoned now. As midnight approached, Hayes made his way back to the main cavern, checking on Gabriel before settling near the entrance to keep watch. The night was quiet, only the occasional hoot of an owl or rustle of nocturnal creatures disturbing the silence. He must have dozed despite his intentions, because the sound that woke him was close, too close. A soft scraping of boot on stone just outside the mine entrance. Hayes came fully alert instantly, rifle already in his hands, as he silently moved to a defensive position behind a large boulder. His eyes, adjusted to the dim light of the dying fire, could make out a silhouette against the star-filled sky beyond the entrance, a tall, lean figure moving with careful precision. He raised the rifle finger poised on the trigger, then lowered it just as quickly. "Eleanor," he breathed, relief flooding through him. She stepped fully into the cavern, her outline unmistakable now. Her clothes were torn and dirty, her hair tangled with twigs and leaves, but she moved with the same fluid strength as always. When she saw him emerge from behind the boulder, her face relaxed from its tense vigilance. "You made it," she said simply. "So did you." Hayes had to resist the urge to cross the space between them, to verify with touch that she was really there whole and unharmed. "The riders," he asked instead, "lost them in the foothills." Eleanor moved closer to the fire, glancing at Gabriel's sleeping form. "He okay?" Scared but holding up. Hayes studied her in the faint light, noting a fresh cut on her cheekbone and the way she favored her left leg slightly. "You're hurt." She shrugged. "Nothing serious. Enhanced healing, remember." As if to prove her point, she crouched beside the fire, adding a small branch to the embers. "This place is abandoned." "Recently, I think," Hayes said. "They left in a hurry." Eleanor nodded. "There's a compound about half a mile beyond the settlement. That's where they kept us. I scouted it before coming here." She looked up at him, her eyes reflecting the rekindled flames. "It's been cleared out, but not destroyed, like they expect to come back." Hayes sat across from her, keeping his voice low to avoid waking Gabriel. "What did you find?" "Records, files, some equipment they left behind." Eleanor reached into her jacket and withdrew a cloth-wrapped bundle. "Including this." She unwrapped it carefully, revealing a strange bronze helmet wired through with copper filaments. Dried blood crusted the inside. "The device," she explained, to her voice flat but her hands trembling slightly. "It rewires instincts, makes the subjects go feral but controllable." She glanced at Gabriel's sleeping form, but it never worked on him. He tore it off mid-trial. That's when they marked him for disposal. Hayes stared at the device, sickened by its purpose, yet fascinated by its existence. It was proof, tangible evidence of Phoenix's experiments, of the atrocities Eleanor and Gabriel had described. "We need to get this to someone in authority," he said. "Someone who can stop them." Eleanor laughed softly, a bitter sound. "Who?" "The same authorities who've been looking the other way for decades. Phoenix has powerful backers, Hayes. Men who buy senators and judges like cattle. Then we take it to the newspapers, make it public. Something so awful they can't ignore it." She considered this, then nodded slowly. "Maybe, but first we need more. This is just one piece, one device. They could claim it was a medical experiment gone wrong, or a prototype for mining equipment." She rewrapped the helmet carefully. "We need to find Ashlock Ridge. That's where the real operation is now." Hayes glanced at Gabriel's sleeping form. "It's dangerous for all of us, but especially for him." "Everywhere is dangerous for him until Phoenix is stopped." Eleanor said, her voice hardening. "They won't give up. Not on him, not on me, not even on you now that you're involved. We either end this or we spend the rest of our lives running." The truth of her words settled heavily between them. There was no going back to the peaceful existence they'd briefly shared at Stillwater Ranch. That life was already behind them, as surely as if it had happened to different people in a different time. "Get some rest," Hayes said finally. "We'll head for Ashlock Ridge at first light." Eleanor nodded, stretching out on her bedroll near the fire. But as Hayes moved to resume his watch, she caught his hand, her grip unexpectedly gentle. "I'm glad you're both safe," she said softly. Hayes squeezed her hand in response, words failing him. When he reluctantly let go and moved toward the entrance, he could still feel the warmth of her touch, a reminder of what they were fighting for, not just justice or safety, but the chance for something more. Something like happiness. The next morning, they gathered around a small fire, planning their next move. Gabriel seemed rejuvenated by Eleanor's return, his eyes brighter, his posture more confident. "Ashlock Ridge is at least 2 days' ride from here," Hayes said, tracing the route on the crude map they had sketched. "We'll need to be careful after yesterday's pursuit. Phoenix will have patrols out looking for us." Eleanor nodded, her face thoughtful. "We should avoid the main trails, stick to the high country where there's more cover." But first," Hayes said, "I want to find Judge Mason." Eleanor looked up sharply. "Who?" "Thomas Mason, former Union officer, now a circuit judge. He's based in Copper Springs, about a day's ride southeast of here." Hayes met her questioning gaze. "Nathaniel was writing to him about the missing children. If anyone might be willing to help us officially, it's Mason." Eleanor considered this, her natural caution warring with the logic of Hayes' suggestion. "Can he be trusted?" "With my life," Hayes said simply. "He saved it more than once during the war." Gabriel, who had been listening intently, spoke up. "A doctor helped me escape," he said quietly. "She wasn't like the others. She left a door unlocked, told me which way to run." "A doctor?" Eleanor's brow furrowed. "Do you remember her name?" Gabriel nodded. "Dr. Hayes, Clara Hayes." He looked at Samuel. "I thought maybe she was related to you. That's partly why I came to your ranch." Hayes shook his head slowly. "I don't have any relatives named Clara." He glanced at Eleanor. "Could be a coincidence." "Phoenix doesn't believe in coincidences," Eleanor said. "But it is a common name." She turned to Gabriel. "What did she look like, this Dr. Hayes?" Young Gabriel said, his face screwing up in concentration. "Younger than the other doctors. Brown hair, glasses. She was nice to us when the others weren't looking." His voice lowered. "She told me about her sister once. Said she was like me, but she died." Eleanor and Hayes exchanged a glance, both thinking the same thing. Could this Dr. Hayes be an ally within Phoenix? Someone who had seen the truth of what they were doing and decided to act. "All the more reason to find Mason," Hayes said. "If there are others who know about Phoenix who might be willing to help us, he would know." Eleanor nodded, her decision made. "Southeast to Copper Springs, then. But we move carefully. Phoenix will have eyes everywhere now." Yes, they broke camp, efficiently erasing all signs of their presence. Before leaving the mine shaft, Hayes explored one last tunnel, hoping to find more evidence they could take to Mason. In a partially collapsed chamber, he discovered a metal box wedged beneath a fallen timber. Inside were more papers, mostly technical documents he couldn't understand, but also a ledger with names and dates. Some of the names he recognized, children who had gone missing from the surrounding territories over the past decade. And beside each name, notations: viable, enhanced, failed, terminated. Hayes felt sick as he leafed through the pages. How many children had Phoenix taken? How many had died in their experiments? And how had they operated for so long without anyone stopping them? He tucked the ledger inside his coat next to the strange device Eleanor had recovered. Together, they might be enough to convince Mason of the truth and perhaps to begin building a case against Phoenix that even their powerful backers couldn't dismiss. They left Morrow Gap under the cover of early morning mist, riding single file with Hayes in the lead, Gabriel in the middle, and Eleanor bringing up the rear, her enhanced senses alert for any sign of pursuit. Instead of taking the direct route to Copper Springs, they kept to the high ridges and dense forests, sacrificing speed for safety. By midday, they had covered less ground than Hayes had hoped, but they had seen no sign of Phoenix patrols. They stopped in a sheltered hollow to rest the horses and eat a cold lunch, unwilling to risk a fire that might be spotted. As they prepared to continue, Gabriel suddenly stiffened his head, turning sharply eastward. "Someone's coming," he whispered, his hand going to the back of his neck, where Hayes now knew a chip had been implanted, one of Phoenix's enhancements, that allowed the boy to sense approaching threats. They moved quickly to conceal themselves in a dense thicket, Hayes with his rifle ready, Eleanor positioning herself to protect Gabriel. The sound of hooves soon reached them, a single rider moving at a steady pace along the game trail below their position. Hayes peered through the brush, trying to get a clear view of the approaching figure. What he saw made him lower his rifle in surprise. "Mason," he breathed. The rider was a man in his 50s, lean and weathered, with the straight-back posture of a former soldier. He wore plain clothes, but had a judge's pin visible on his lapel. A rifle was slung across his back, and his eyes scanned the terrain with the wariness of someone who knew he might be watched. Hayes stepped out of concealment, hands held slightly away from his body to show he wasn't a threat. "Thomas," he called. The rider reined in sharply, his hand dropping to a pistol at his hip before recognition dawned. "Samuel, what the hell are you doing out here?" "Looking for you, as it happens." Hayes gestured for Eleanor and Gabriel to join him. "We need to talk, somewhere safe." Mason took in the woman and boy with a quick assessing glance. His eyes lingered on Eleanor, noting her unusual height and the wariness in her stance. Then he looked at Gabriel, his expression softening slightly at the sight of the boy's obvious youth and the healing wounds visible on his arms. "I know a place," he said finally. "About an hour from here. Old line shack, abandoned but solid. We can talk there." Hayes nodded, and they fell in alongside Mason, who led them off the trail and into a series of ravines that would have been nearly impossible to navigate without intimate knowledge of the land. "Got your letter," Mason said as they rode. "Started connecting some dots of my own. Was on my way to find you when I ran across some strange tracks, military-style boot prints, where there shouldn't be any. Phoenix, Eleanor said, speaking for the first time. Mason glanced at her sharply. That's what they call themselves, the ones taking the children. Eleanor nodded. I was one of them. Subject E8. Mason's expression darkened. And the boy, Gabriel, Hayes said. 17D, he escaped recently. Mason looked back at the trail ahead, his jaw tight. Your brother was right, Samuel. There's something evil happening in these mountains. He was getting close to proving it when he died. It wasn't an accident, Hayes said, his voice flat. No, Mason agreed. I never thought it was. The line shack was exactly as Mason had described, abandoned but structurally sound, nestled in a small clearing surrounded by dense forest. They unsaddled the horses and led them to a lean-to at the back of the cabin where Mason had already stashed feed and water. Inside the shack was spare but serviceable a table, a few chairs, a stone fireplace, and a narrow bunk against one wall. Mason lit a lantern, illuminating the dusty interior. We should be safe here, he said. No one knows about this place except me and a few others. Others? Eleanor asked, her wariness returning. Mason nodded, understanding her caution. Former soldiers, mostly. Men who've seen things they can't explain and won't ignore. We call ourselves the Watchmen. Been tracking strange disappearances for years, trying to piece together what's happening. Hayes felt a surge of hope. They weren't alone in this fight. How many of you are there? Dozen or so scattered across the territory. Some higher up, marshals, judges like me. Others just ordinary folk who've lost someone. Mason's eyes darkened. We've suspected some kind of organization behind it all, but we never had a name until now, Phoenix. Eleanor had been prowling the cabin, checking exits, assessing defensive positions. Now she stopped, turning to face Mason. Judge Mason, what I'm about to tell you will sound impossible, but I need you to listen. Mason settled into a chair, his expression grave. I'm listening. Eleanor told him everything about Phoenix's origins during the war, their experiments, the enhancements, and conditioning the device and its purpose. She spoke without emotion, laying out the facts as if giving testimony in court. When she finished, the cabin was silent, save for the soft crackling of the fire Hayes had built. Mason looked at her for a long moment, then at Gabriel, who had fallen asleep on the bunk, exhaustion finally claiming him. I believe you, he said simply. Hayes felt something tighten his chest, ease slightly. They had been believed by someone with the authority to help them. There's more, he said, withdrawing the ledger and the device from inside his coat. Evidence? Mason examined both carefully, his expression growing darker with each page of the ledger he turned. This is monstrous, he said finally. Children treated like laboratory animals. And this device, he handled it gingerly as if it might activate on its own. This is beyond anything I imagined. We need to stop them, Hayes said. Not just this outpost or that one, but all of Phoenix. And we need to do it legally through the courts, so there's no question of what happened here. Mason nodded slowly. It won't be easy. From what you've told me, Phoenix has powerful backers. Men who won't want this exposed. He tapped the ledger. But with this and your testimonies, we might have a chance. There's more, Eleanor said. A doctor at Phoenix, Clara Hayes. She helped Gabriel escape. She might be willing to testify. Mason looked up sharply. Hayes, any relation to you, Samuel? Hayes shook his head. Not that I know of. Mason's brow furrowed in thought. Clara Hayes. The name sounds familiar. He rose and crossed to a saddlebag he had hung by the door, withdrawing a small notebook. I keep records of anyone connected to the disappearances, whether victim or suspect. He leafed through the pages and stopped, his finger marking a spot. Here it is. Clara Hayes, daughter of Dr. Sarah Hayes, who worked at a military hospital during the war. Sarah died under mysterious circumstances about 15 years ago. Clara would have been a child then. Hayes felt a chill run down his spine. Sarah Hayes, he repeated. Any relation to me? Mason shook his head. I don't think so. Hayes is a common enough name, but... He hesitated, glancing at Eleanor. But what? She pressed. Sarah Hayes was investigated briefly in connection with a series of unexplained deaths at the hospital where she worked. The charges were dropped, but there were rumors, experiments of some kind. Mason closed the notebook. If she was involved with the early Phoenix program and her daughter is now working for them, she might be trying to uncover the truth about her mother's death, Hayes finished, or avenge it. Eleanor looked thoughtful. Gabriel said she mentioned a sister who was like him but died. Could Phoenix have experimented on their own doctor's children? From what you've told me, they're capable of anything, Mason said grimly. The implications hung in the air between them, the possibility of an ally within Phoenix, someone with access to their records and facilities, someone who might be able to help them expose the organization from within. We need to find her, Hayes said. This Clara Hayes. If she helped Gabriel escape, she might help us. She's at Ashlock Ridge. Gabriel's voice came from the bunk where he had apparently been awake and listening. That's where she works, in the labs. Mason nodded decisively. Then that's where we need to go next, Ashlock Ridge. He turned to Hayes. But not alone. I'll send in word to the other watchmen. We'll need backup for this. Hayes felt a surge of hope. With Mason and the watchmen on their side, they might actually have a chance against Phoenix. Not just to expose one facility or save a few children, but to bring down the entire organization. Eleanor, however, looked less convinced. Can your watchmen be trusted? She asked Mason bluntly. Phoenix has spies everywhere. Infiltrators. How do you know none of your people are working for them? It was a fair question, and Hayes was glad she had asked it. Mason didn't seem offended. I don't know for certain, he admitted, but we're careful. Each man vouches for the others, and we've worked together for years. If any of us were Phoenix, I think we'd have seen signs by now. Eleanor nodded, accepting his answer, though not entirely satisfied. When do we leave for Ashlock Ridge? Tomorrow, Mason decided. I need to get word to my men tonight. We'll meet them on the way. He looked at each of them in turn. Get some rest. You've all been through hell, and I have a feeling things are going to get worse before they get better. As darkness fell, they settled into the small cabin, taking turns on watch. Hayes took the first shift, sitting by the door with his rifle across his knees, listening to the night sounds of the forest. Behind him, Eleanor and Gabriel slept on the narrow bunk, the boy curled against her side like a child seeking comfort from a mother. The sight made Hayes's chest ache with a complicated mixture of emotions, tenderness, protectiveness, and a growing determination to end this fight so that they might have a chance at something like a normal life. Not just for himself, but for Eleanor and Gabriel, too. Mason joined him by the door, offering a cup of coffee and sitting down on an upturned crate. She's remarkable, he said quietly, nodding toward Eleanor. To have survived what she did and still be so human. Hayes nodded, watching the gentle rise and fall of Eleanor's chest as she slept. She's the strongest person I've ever known, he said simply. Mason studied him for a moment, a knowing look in his eyes. You care for her. It wasn't a question, but Hayes answered anyway. Yes. And the boy, Hayes looked at Gabriel, so young and yet so marked by suffering. He deserves a chance at a real life. They both do. Mason sipped his coffee, his expression thoughtful. What will you do when this is over? Assuming we succeed. Hayes hadn't allowed himself to think that far ahead, too focused on the immediate fight. But now, prompted by Mason's question, he found himself imagining a future Eleanor and Gabriel at Stillwater Ranch, building a life together, healing from all they had endured. I don't know, he said finally. Take them home, I suppose, if that's what they want. Mason nodded, understanding the unspoken complexity in those simple words. Get some sleep, he said, rising. I'll take the next watch. Hayes finished his coffee and moved to the floor near the bunk, spreading his bedroll. As he settled in, Eleanor's eyes opened briefly, meeting his in the dim light from the dying fire. We'll make it, she whispered, as if she had been reading his thoughts about the future. All of us. Hayes nodded, hoping she was right. Tomorrow they would ride for Ashlock Ridge, and whatever awaited them, there would determine not just their fate, but potentially the future of countless children still in Phoenix's grasp. As he drifted towards sleep, Hayes found himself thinking of Nathaniel. We're finishing what you started, brother, he thought. We'll make it right. They left the line shack at dawn, Mason leading them along hidden trails that wound through the mountains toward Ashlock Ridge. The judge had sent a message the night before, carried by a trusted ally who had appeared silently out of the darkness and disappeared just as mysteriously. Who was that? Eleanor had asked, watching the messenger vanish into the trees. Former scout, Mason had replied. Comanche captive as a boy, learned their ways, best tracker I've ever known. He had smiled slightly at her obvious wariness. And no, he's not Phoenix. Lost his daughter to them 5 years ago. Been hunting them ever since. Now, as they rode through the early morning mist, Hayes found himself watching Eleanor more than the trail. She had been unusually quiet since their conversation with Mason, her face set in lines of concentration. Occasionally, she would reach up to touch the back of her neck, where Hayes knew the scars from the device lay hidden beneath her hair. "What are you thinking?" he asked quietly, bringing his horse alongside hers as the path widened. Eleanor glanced at him, then back at the trail ahead. "About Clara Hayes," she said. "If she's really helping subjects escape, she's taking an enormous risk. Phoenix doesn't tolerate betrayal." "You think it could be a trap?" Eleanor considered this, then shook her head slowly. "No, Gabriel's reaction was too genuine. But I'm wondering why she would help him, why she would stay at Phoenix if she knows what they're doing." "Maybe she's gathering evidence like we are," Hayes suggested, trying to build a case from the inside. "Maybe?" Eleanor didn't sound convinced. "Or maybe she has another agenda entirely." Before Hayes could respond, Gabriel rode up beside them, his face anxious. "Will we find the others?" he asked. "The ones still at Ashlock Ridge." Eleanor's expression softened as she looked at the boy. "We'll try," she promised. "And if they're there, we'll get them out." Gabriel nodded, seemingly satisfied with her answer. He dropped back slightly, giving them privacy again. "He worries about the others," Eleanor said quietly. "Even after everything Phoenix did to him, he still thinks of those left behind." Hayes nodded, feeling a surge of pride for the boy's resilience and compassion. "He's a good kid, strong." "Like his guardian," Eleanor said, the ghost of a smile touching her lips as she glanced at Hayes. The unexpected compliment warmed him more than he cared to admit. Before he could respond, Mason signaled from the front of their small column a halt and silence. They reined in, everyone instantly alert. Mason dismounted and moved back to join them, his movements quiet and controlled. "Patrol ahead," he whispered. "Phoenix by the looks of them. 4 men armed." Hayes felt his pulse quicken. "How far to Ashlock Ridge?" "About 5 miles," Mason replied. "We're entering their territory now." Eleanor slid from her horse, her movements fluid and silent. "I'll scout ahead," she said. "See if there's a way around them." Hayes wanted to object, the memory of their last separation still fresh, but he knew her enhanced senses made her the logical choice. "Be careful," he said instead. She nodded, then melted into the forest with a stealth that would have impressed even Mason's Comanche-trained scout. They waited in tense silence, minutes stretching into what felt like hours. Gabriel sat rigid in his saddle, his eyes closed, apparently using his own enhancements to track movements beyond normal hearing. "She's coming back," he said, suddenly opening his eyes. "And she's not alone." Hayes reached for his rifle, but Mason placed a restraining hand on his arm. "Wait," he murmured. "Let's see who it is." Eleanor emerged from the trees, followed by a woman Hayes didn't recognize, young, with brown hair pulled back in a severe bun, wearing a physician's coat over practical riding clothes. What struck Hayes most were her eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles, intelligent, wary, and haunted by something he couldn't name. "Dr. Hayes," Gabriel breathed, recognition and relief washing over his face. The woman's gaze went immediately to the boy, a similar relief evident in her expression. "Gabriel," she said softly, "you made it." Eleanor remained tense, positioned where she could intervene if the doctor made any threatening move. "I found her watching the trail," she explained. "Said she was looking for us." Clara Hayes nodded, her attention now on Mason and Hayes. "Judge Mason," she said, recognizing him, "your reputation precedes you, and you must be Samuel Hayes." Her gaze was appraising, clinical almost. "Yes, I see the resemblance." Hayes frowned. "Resemblance to whom?" The doctor seemed surprised by the question. "To your mother, of course. Sarah Hayes." A cold shock ran through Hayes. "My mother's name was Emma. Emma Hayes. She died when I was a child." Clara's expression shifted to confusion, then dawning comprehension. "They never told you," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "Of course they didn't." "Told me what?" Hayes demanded, an unease growing in his stomach. Clara glanced at Eleanor, then back at Hayes. "This isn't how I planned to do this," she said. "But we don't have much time. Phoenix knows you're coming. They're evacuating Ashlock Ridge as we speak, destroying evidence, moving subjects to a new facility." "How do they know?" Mason asked sharply. "They have spies everywhere," Clara said. "And She hesitated, then continued. Your messenger was intercepted. I'm sorry. Mason's face darkened. Hank, is he alive? Last I saw him, Clara assured him. But they're questioning him. Harshly. Hayes processed this information, but his mind kept returning to the doctor's earlier comment. What did you mean about my mother? Clara took a deep breath as if steeling herself. Sarah Hayes was not just any doctor at Phoenix. She was one of the founders alongside Hammond and Reed, but she had regrets about what they were doing, about what she had helped create. Hayes felt as if the ground were shifting beneath him. That's impossible. My mother died when I was 10, influenza. That's what they told you, Clara said gently. What they told everyone. But she didn't die then. She was recruited by Hammond during the war, her death faked to free her from family obligations. She worked with Phoenix until about 15 years ago when she tried to stop the program, tried to expose what they were doing to the children. Eleanor had moved closer, her attention fixed on Clara's every word. And they killed her for it. She said not a question, but a statement. Clara nodded. They made it look like a heart attack. But before she died, she managed to hide away certain samples, genetic material, from herself and from special subjects. Material she had been using to create enhanced children, but which she intended to use as evidence. And you're her daughter, Eleanor said. That's why you're at Phoenix, to finish what she started. Yes. Clara's gaze moved from Eleanor to Hayes, and there was a weight to it that made his skin prickle. But I'm not her only legacy. She had her own enhancements, early versions that allowed her to bear children even into her 40s. Children who inherited certain traits. Hayes felt a cold realization dawning. What are you saying? Eleanor wasn't just created from random genetic material, Clara said. She was created from your mother's DNA. Biologically speaking, she's your half-sister. The world seemed to stop for Hayes. He stared at Clara, then at Eleanor, whose face had gone completely still, her eyes wide with shock. That's not possible, Hayes said. But even as he denied it, pieces began falling into place. Eleanor's height, similar to his own, the way she moved sometimes with a grace that had seemed oddly familiar from the beginning. It's more than possible, Clara said. It's certain. I've seen the records. Dr. Sarah Hayes provided her own genetic material for the S series of subjects, of which Eleanor's subject E8 was one of the most successful. Eleanor had not moved, had not spoken. She stood like a statue, her face unreadable, though Hayes thought he could see a storm of emotions in her eyes. Why, she finally asked, her voice barely audible. Why would she use her own? Because she believed she could create enhanced humans who wouldn't lose their humanity, Clara explained. Who would have her resistance to conditioning her strength of will? And she was right. She looked at Eleanor with something like pride. You were her greatest success. You escaped. You retained your sense of self despite everything they did to you. Hayes felt dizzy with the implications. Eleanor, the woman he had been developing feelings for, was his sister, half-sister, created in a laboratory using his mother's DNA. It was impossible, unbelievable. And yet, looking at her now, he could see what Clara saw, the echo of Sarah Hayes in Eleanor's face, in the stubborn set of her jaw, in the fierce intelligence of her eyes. We don't have time for this now. Mason interrupted, his practical nature asserting itself. Phoenix is evacuating Ashlock Ridge. We need to move quickly if we're going to stop them. Clara nodded visibly, pulling herself together. You're right. I have transportation waiting about a mile from here. I can get us into the facility. My access codes still work. But we need to hurry. Hayes forced himself to focus on the mission, pushing aside the personal revelation for now. What about your watchman? He asked Mason. If Hank was intercepted, they won't know to come, Mason said grimly. It's just us. Eleanor finally spoke, her voice steady despite the shock she must be feeling. Then it's enough, she said simply. It has to be. Hayes met her eyes, searching for some sign of how she was processing the news of their relationship. But her face was composed, focused on the task at hand. They would deal with the personal implications later if they survived what was to come. Let's go, he said, turning to Clara. Lead the way. Clara's transportation turned out to be a Phoenix supply wagon requisitioned for what she had told her superiors was a specimen collection mission. They concealed their horses in a dense thicket, with Gabriel reluctantly staying behind to watch them, protected by Mason. I want to come, the boy had protested, his face set in stubborn lines. You've done your part, Eleanor had told him gently. Now let us do ours. And if we don't come back, she had glanced at Mason, who nodded understanding. I'll get him somewhere safe, the judge had promised. Somewhere Phoenix will never find him. Now as Hayes and Eleanor rode in the back of the wagon concealed beneath canvas and crates, Hayes found himself acutely aware of Eleanor beside him. Sister. The word kept echoing in his mind, changing everything and nothing at the same time. You're thinking too loudly, Eleanor said quietly, her voice barely audible over the rumble of the wagon wheels. Hayes turned to look at her, difficult in the dim light filtering through the canvas. Eleanor, not now, she interrupted but gently. When this is over, when we're free of them completely, then we'll figure out what it means, what we are to each other. Hayes nodded, accepting her wisdom. They needed to focus on the mission, on stopping Phoenix, on saving the children still in their grasp. The personal revelations could wait. The wagon slowed, then stopped. They heard Clara speaking to someone, a guard presumably, her voice calm and authoritative. There was a pause, then the wagon began moving again, more slowly now. We're inside the perimeter, Eleanor whispered. Get ready. Hayes checked his weapons one last time, a pistol in his holster and a knife in his boot. Eleanor carried no weapons. Her enhanced strength and speed made her deadly enough without them. The wagon came to a final stop and they heard Clara jump down from the driver's seat. A moment later, she lifted the canvas at the back. Quickly, she said, we're at a service entrance. No guards here right now, but that could change any minute. They slipped from the wagon, finding themselves in a loading bay attached to what appeared to be an ordinary warehouse. But as Clara led them through a side door and down a corridor, the industrial facade gave way to something very different. A clean clinical facility with white walls and floors that gleamed under harsh electric lights. This way, Clara said, leading them to an elevator. She pressed her palm to a panel beside it and the door slid open. My access still works. Good. Inside, she pressed a button marked B2. The elevator began to descend, the only sound the soft hum of machinery. What will we find down there? Hayes asked. The heart of Phoenix, Clara replied. Their records, their research, and, she hesitated, their subjects, the children they're preparing to move. How many? Eleanor asked, her voice tight with tension. At least 6 that I know of, maybe more. The elevator stopped and the doors opened onto another corridor, this one dimmer and more institutional than the one above. Numbered doors lined the hallway, small observation windows set into each. Clara led them forward cautiously. The control room is at the end of this hall. That's where they monitor the subjects. From there, we can access the central database, download their records, and locate the children. They moved silently along the corridor, Hayes checking the rooms as they passed. Through the first observation window, he saw a small figure huddled on a bed, a girl perhaps 9 or 10 with unnaturally pale skin and vacant eyes. The second room held a boy about Gabriel's age, sitting cross-legged on the floor, rocking slightly. The third room stopped Hayes cold. Inside, a child of indeterminate gender lay strapped to a bed, a device attached to their head. Not the crude helmet Eleanor had recovered from Morrow Gap, but a sleeker, more sophisticated version. The child's eyes were open, but unseeing, their body occasionally twitching, as if responding to unseen stimuli. Eleanor, he whispered, his voice rough with horror. She joined him at the window, her face hardening at the sight. Without hesitation, she tried the door, locked as expected, but unlike the sophisticated electronic locks above, this was a simple mechanical lock, which yielded to her enhanced strength with a sharp snap. The sound echoed down the corridor, followed immediately by silence, as voices ahead stopped mid-conversation. Go, Eleanor hissed, pushing the door open. Get the child. I'll deal with whoever's coming. She didn't wait for his response, already moving toward the source of the voices with predatory grace. Hayes entered the room, approaching the bed cautiously. The child, a boy he could now see no more than 8, didn't respond to his presence, still lost in whatever nightmare the device was creating. With careful hands, Hayes examined the helmet, looking for a way to remove it without causing harm. It was attached via thin wires to a machine beside the bed, lights blinking in patterns he couldn't interpret. Deciding that speed was more important than caution, he disconnected the wires from the machine. The effect was immediate and disturbing. The boy's body arched off the bed, a silent scream contorting his features, then collapsed back completely still. For a terrible moment, Hayes thought he had killed the child. Then the small chest rose in a shuddering breath, and the boy's eyes focused confusion, replacing the vacant stare. "It's okay," Hayes said softly, working to unfasten the restraints. "I'm here to help you. Can you tell me your name?" The boy blinked slowly as if the concept of a name was foreign. "T26B, he whispered. "Know your real name. Before they brought you here." Another long pause, then James. "I think I was James." "Good, James, that's good." Hayes freed the last restraint and helped the boy sit up. "We're going to get you out of here, but you need to be very quiet and do exactly as I say." "Can you do that?" James nodded, his movements jerky but determined. Hayes carefully removed the helmet, revealing a shaved head marked with small surgical scars, evidence of whatever they had done to allow the device to interface with his brain. From the corridor came the sounds of struggle, a crash, a cry cut short, then running footsteps. Clara appeared in the doorway, a cut on her cheek, but otherwise unharmed. "Eleanor's handling the guards," she said tersely, "but they've triggered an alarm. We have minutes at most before security arrives." She looked at James, her expression softening slightly. "Can he walk?" "I think so." Hayes helped the boy to his feet, steadying him when he swayed. "There are at least 3 more children here," Clara said. "I'll get them. You help Eleanor." Hayes hesitated, torn between helping Clara free the other children and finding Eleanor. Clara made the decision for him. "Go," she said firmly. "Eleanor needs you more than I do. These locks are nothing to me. I have the codes." She held up a key card. "Get to the control room. Download everything you can. I'll meet you there with the children." Hayes nodded reluctantly, leaving James with Clara. He moved down the corridor toward the sounds of conflict, his pistol ready. He rounded a corner to find Eleanor engaged in combat with 2 Phoenix security guards. She moved with breathtaking speed and precision, her enhanced strength evident in the way she threw one man against a wall with a single blow. The second guard raised a weapon, not a gun, but some kind of device that emitted a high-pitched whine. Eleanor staggered, her hands going to her ears, her face contorted in pain. Hayes didn't hesitate. He fired his bullet, striking the man's shoulder, causing him to drop the device. It clattered to the floor, still emitting its painful sound. Eleanor recovered quickly, crossing the space to the fallen device and crushing it beneath her boot. The whine cut off abruptly. "Thanks," she said, breathing hard. "Control room." Hayes nodded toward a door at the end of the hall marked monitoring. Together they approached it cautiously, Eleanor taking the lead. The door was locked, but like the others, it yielded to her strength. Inside, they found a room filled with monitors showing various areas of the facility. Most displayed empty corridors or laboratories, but 3 showed what appeared to be living quarters, small cells-like rooms where children sat or lay on narrow beds. Against one wall stood a bank of computers, screens glowing with data and graphs Hayes couldn't interpret. Eleanor moved to them, immediately scanning the information. "Research files," she said. "Everything Phoenix has been doing, the enhancements, the conditioning, the device." Her fingers moved over the keyboard with surprising skill. "I'm downloading it all." Hayes kept watch at the door, alert for any sign of approaching security. "Hurry," he urged. "We don't know how much time we have." Eleanor worked hard, quickly inserting a small device Clara had given her into a port on the computer. "This will copy everything," she said. "All the evidence we need to expose Phoenix." As the data transferred, Hayes watched the monitors tracking Clara's progress through the facility. She had freed 2 more children and was leading them toward the control room, moving with the confident stride of someone who belonged there. Then another figure appeared on one of the monitors, a man in an immaculate suit walking purposefully down a corridor that would intercept Clara's path. Harrison Reed. "Eleanor," Hayes said urgently. "Oh, Reed is here. He's going to run into Clara and the children." Eleanor looked up from the computer, her eyes widening as she saw the monitor. "The download's not finished." "Another minute." Hayes made a split-second decision. "Stay here, finish it. I'll help Clara." Before Eleanor could protest, he was out the door, running down the corridor toward where he had seen Reed on the monitor. He moved as quietly as his military training allowed, using the skills that had kept him alive behind enemy lines during the war. He reached an intersection and peered around the corner cautiously. Reed stood about 20 feet away, blocking Clara's path. The doctor had pushed the children behind her, her stance protective but defiant. "Dr. Hayes," Reed was saying, his voice coolly professional, I'm disappointed. After all Phoenix has done for you, provided you with employment resources, the chance to continue your mother's work, this is how you repay us. My mother wanted to stop Phoenix, Clara replied, her voice steady despite the danger. She wanted to expose what you were doing to these children. What you did to her. Reed's smile was cold. Sarah knew what she was getting into. She volunteered for the enhancements just as you benefited from them. Or did you think your intelligence, your perfect recall, your resistance to disease, those were natural gifts? Hayes felt a chill run through him. Clara had been enhanced too, not as obviously as Eleanor, but in subtler ways. Let us pass Reed, Clara said. It's over. We have the evidence. We have witnesses. Phoenix is finished. Reed laughed, a sound devoid of humor. Phoenix has survived for decades, Doctor. Through wars, investigations, setbacks, we will survive this too. He reached into his coat and withdrew not a gun, but a small silver device similar to the one the guard had used against Eleanor. Now step aside. The subjects are coming with me. Hayes decided he had heard enough. He stepped around the corner, his pistol aimed at Reed's chest. Drop it, he commanded. Reed turned, showing no surprise at Hayes' appearance. Sergeant Hayes, he said smoothly. Or I suppose it's... Sergeant Hayes, Reed said smoothly. Or I suppose it's just Mr. Hayes now. Come to play the hero. His hand remained steady, the silver device pointed at Clara and the children. Put it down, Reed. Hayes repeated, his pistol unwavering. It's over. Reed's smile never faltered. Nothing is over. Phoenix is bigger than you can imagine. More essential than you could comprehend. We are creating the future. By torturing children, Hayes took a step forward. By stripping away their humanity. Enhancing, Reed corrected. Improving. What is humanity but potential waiting to be fulfilled? These subjects, he gestured toward the cowering children behind Clara, are the next stage in human evolution, guided by science rather than random chance. From behind Reed came the soft sound of footsteps. Eleanor appeared at the far end of the corridor, her face set in hard lines, her movements silent and predatory. Reed, focused on Hayes, didn't notice her approach. Evolution isn't meant to be guided, Hayes said, keeping Reed's attention. And it certainly isn't meant to be forced on children who can't consent. Reed laughed. Consent? Did any of us consent to be born, to have the genes we have, the limitations we bear? His voice took on a passionate intensity. Phoenix is freeing humanity from those limitations, creating people who are stronger, faster, smarter, better in every way. And controllable, Eleanor said from behind him. That's the part you're leaving out. Reed spun, bringing the device to bear on Eleanor, but she was faster. Her hand closed around his wrist with crushing force, and the device clattered to the floor. With her other hand, she gripped Reed's throat, lifting him until his feet barely touched the ground. Eleanor, Hayes cautioned, seeing the rage in her eyes, the tension in her body that spoke of how easily she could snap Reed's neck. We need him alive. For evidence. For a moment he thought she wouldn't listen, that the years of suffering at Phoenix's hands would overwhelm her restraint. Then slowly she lowered Reed to the ground, though she maintained her grip on his throat. You're right, she said, her voice tight with controlled fury. He needs to face justice. Real justice. Reed, despite his precarious position, managed a strained laugh. Justice from whom? The same governments that have funded Phoenix for decades, the same courts that have looked the other way while we operated with impunity. His eyes, cold and calculating, moved from Eleanor to Hayes. We own the system you think will protect you. Not all of it, Clara said. She had moved forward, the children still behind her. There are still honest judges, newspapers that can't be bought, people who will be horrified by what you've done. Reed's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes, a momentary uncertainty that told Hayes Clara's words had struck home. Phoenix might have powerful backers, might have infiltrated parts of the government and justice system, but they couldn't control everything. Tie him up, Hayes told Eleanor. We need to get these children out of here. As Eleanor secured Reed with his own belt and necktie, Hayes checked the corridor in both directions. Where's the nearest exit? He asked Clara. Service elevator back the way you came, she replied. It leads to the loading dock where we left the wagon. Hayes nodded. Let's move. The alarm's been triggered. More security will be coming. They moved as a group, Hayes leading Clara, guiding the children, and Eleanor bringing up the rear with Reed. The Phoenix director had fallen silent, his earlier confidence replaced by a calculating watchfulness that Hayes found more concerning than his threats. They reached the control room where Hayes had left Eleanor, and she ducked inside, briefly emerging with the device that contained the downloaded Phoenix files. "Everything's here," she said, pocketing it. "All the evidence we need." They continued to the elevator, moving as quickly as the weakened children could manage. One girl, smaller than the others with pale blonde hair, stumbled, her legs giving out beneath her. Without hesitation, Eleanor handed Reed to Hayes and scooped the child into her arms, carrying her as easily as if she weighed nothing. The elevator doors opened at their approach, and they crowded inside. Clara pressed the button for the ground floor, and they began to ascend. "What about the other children?" Hayes asked. "You said there were at least 6. "I could only find these 4, Clara said, her face grim. "The others must have already been moved." Hayes felt a pang of regret for those they couldn't save, but pushed it aside. They had rescued 4 children who would now have a chance at real lives free from Phoenix's control. The elevator stopped and the door slid open to reveal the loading dock. The wagon was still there, apparently undisturbed. But Hayes' sense of unease grew as they crossed the open space toward it. It had been too easy. Phoenix was too organized, too cautious to allow them to simply walk out with their subjects and their secrets. "Something's wrong," he murmured to Eleanor, who nodded, having clearly reached the same conclusion. They had almost reached the wagon when the trap was sprung. Doors burst open on either side of the loading dock, and armed men poured in, at least a dozen, all in Phoenix security uniforms, all with weapons trained on their small group. From behind the security team emerged a woman Hayes had never seen but instantly recognized from Eleanor's descriptions. Tall, elegant, despite her age, with silver-streaked dark hair pulled back in a severe bun. Dr. Evelyn Vaughn, one of Phoenix's leading scientists. "Dr. Hayes," she said, addressing Clara with cold disappointment. "I had such hopes for you, such expectations. Your mother would be ashamed." "My mother would be proud," Clara replied, her voice steady despite the guns aimed at them. "She tried to stop you too in the end." Vaughn's expression hardened. Sarah was weak, sentimental. She lost sight of the greater purpose. Her gaze shifted to Eleanor. "As did you, E8. You could have been magnificent, the pinnacle of our program, a leader of our enhanced forces. Instead, you chose this." She gestured dismissively at Hayes and the children. Eleanor's face remained impassive, but Hayes could see the tension in her body, the way she positioned herself to shield the children behind her. "I chose freedom," she said simply, "for myself and for them." Vaughn laughed, a sound as cold and clinical as her appearance. "Freedom, what is freedom but chaos, unpredictability? We offer something better, purpose, direction, the chance to be part of something greater than any individual." "Spare us the recruitment speech," Hayes said. "We've seen what your something greater really is. Children in cages, minds controlled by devices, humanity stripped away in the name of progress." Vaughn's gaze shifted to him, assessing and dismissive in equal measure. "Samuel Hayes, the brother who was never quite good enough. Did you know your mother spoke of you rarely and with such disappointment?" Hayes felt the words like a physical blow, but refused to show it. "If you're trying to manipulate me, you'll have to do better than that. I know who my mother was and who she wasn't." Vaughn smiled thinly. "Do you? Clara has filled your head with her romantic notions of Sarah Hayes as some kind of reluctant hero, a scientist with a conscience. The truth is far more complicated. Sarah was ambitious, brilliant, utterly dedicated to Phoenix's mission. It was only at the end, when her mind began to fail, that she developed these ethical concerns." "You're lying," Clara said, her voice tight with anger. "My mother left detailed records. She knew what Phoenix was doing was wrong. She tried to stop you." "And failed," Vaughn said coldly, "as you have failed." She gestured to the security team. "Take the subjects back to their quarters. Dr. Hayes will face disciplinary measures. As for these 2, she indicated Hayes and Eleanor, they know too much to be allowed to leave." Reed, who had remained silent during this exchange, spoke up from where Eleanor still held him, restrained. "Not so fast, Evelyn." Despite his bound hands and the guns trained on him, he managed to project an air of command. "There's another option." Vaughn frowned. "What are you suggesting?" Harrison, Reed's gaze fixed on Eleanor. "E8 has proven remarkably resistant to conditioning, but perhaps that's because we've been using the wrong approach, the wrong leverage." He glanced meaningfully at Hayes. Hayes felt a chill as he realized what Reed was suggesting, using him to control Eleanor, exploiting the connection between them, whatever that connection might now be. No, Eleanor said, her voice deadly quiet. That won't work either. Before anyone could react, she moved with blinding speed, shoving Reed toward the security team and grabbing Hayes and Clara by their arms. Get down, she shouted to the children, who immediately dropped to the floor. The security team, momentarily confused by Reed stumbling into their midst, hesitated just long enough for Eleanor to drag Hayes and Clara behind a stack of crates near the wagon. Bullets splintered the wood around them as the guards opened fire. The children, Hayes gasped, reaching for his pistol. Stay down, Eleanor commanded. She peered around the edge of the crates, assessing the situation. The children were still huddled on the floor, apparently unharmed, but trapped in the open. Vaughn stood behind her security team, shouting orders. Reed was being untied by one of the guards. Eleanor turned to Clara. The wagon. Can you drive it? Clara nodded. Yes, but when I give her the signal, get to the wagon and be ready to move. Hayes, cover her. Eleanor's eyes met his with determination. I'll get the children. Before Hayes could protest, she was gone, moving with such speed she seemed to blur. She charged directly at the security team, dodging bullets with inhuman reflexes, her enhanced strength allowing her to throw men aside like dolls. Hayes provided covering fire, forcing the remaining guards to take cover. Clara sprinted for the wagon, leaping onto the driver's seat and preparing the team of horses. In the chaos, Vaughn tried to retreat through one of the side doors, but Eleanor intercepted her, knocking the scientist to the ground with a sweep of her leg. Reed was nowhere to be seen. He had apparently taken advantage of the confusion to escape. Eleanor reached the children, gathering two under each arm, despite their size, and ran for the wagon. Hayes continued firing his shots, carefully placed to wound rather than kill. These men were following orders. The real culprits were Reed, Vaughn, and the other Phoenix leaders. Go, Eleanor shouted as she deposited the children in the back of the wagon. Clara didn't need to be told twice. She snapped the reins and the horses lurched forward. Hayes made a run for the wagon, leaping onto the back as it gained speed. Eleanor remained behind, holding Vaughn by the collar of her lab coat. Eleanor, Hayes called, reaching out his hand. Come on. She looked at him, then at Vaughn, clearly torn between escape and the chance to bring one of Phoenix's leaders to justice. Finally, she delivered a precise blow to the back of Vaughn's head, rendering the scientist unconscious, and sprinted after the wagon. She caught up easily, her enhanced speed allowing her to overtake the horses. Hayes pulled her into the back beside him, and they crouched low as bullets continued to fly around them. Clara drove the wagon out of the loading dock and into the bright afternoon sunlight. They careened down the access road, the children clinging to each other. In the back, Hayes and Eleanor returning fire whenever one of the pursuing guards got too close. The gate, Clara called back to them. It'll be closed, probably guarded. Hayes looked ahead and saw she was right. A heavy iron gate blocked the road about 100 yards ahead, with 2 guard posts on either side. Even now, more security personnel were emerging, weapons ready. I'll handle it, Eleanor said. Before Hayes could stop her, she leapt from the moving wagon and sprinted ahead, a blur of motion too fast for the guards to track. She reached the gate seconds before the wagon, tearing it from its hinges with her enhanced strength and using it as a battering ram against the guards who tried to stop her. By the time Clara drove the wagon through, the way was clear. Eleanor jumped back onto the wagon as it passed, breathing hard but otherwise unharmed. Head for the rendezvous point, she told Clara. Mason and Gabriel should be waiting. Hayes kept watch behind them, but to his surprise, the pursuit seemed to have stopped at the gate. They're not following, he said, frowning. They don't need to, Eleanor replied grimly. They know where we're going. Phoenix has spies everywhere, remember? Hayes nodded, the momentary relief replaced by renewed vigilance. They weren't safe yet, not by a long shot. The children huddled together in the back of the wagon, their eyes wide with fear and confusion. The smallest the girl Eleanor had carried was trembling visibly. Without thinking, Hayes put his arm around her thin shoulders. It's okay, he said softly. You're safe now. We won't let them take you back. The girl looked up at him, her pale blue eyes searching his face as if looking for deception. Apparently finding none, she leaned against him slightly, her trembling subsiding. Eleanor watched this interaction, her expression unreadable. Then she turned to check their back trail again, her posture alert for any sign of pursuit. They reached the rendezvous point, a stand of trees near a small stream, to find Mason and Gabriel waiting anxiously. The boy's face lit up when he saw them, especially when he spotted the other children in the wagon. "You did it," he said, running to meet them as Clara reined in the horses. "You got them out." "Some of them," Eleanor corrected, jumping down from the wagon. "There are more still at Phoenix." Mason approached his expression grim but satisfied. "You got the evidence." Eleanor patted her pocket where the device containing the Phoenix files was secured. "Everything, their research, their records, their list of backers, it's all here. And these children are living proof," Claire added, helping the young ones down from the wagon. "Witnesses to what Phoenix has done." Mason nodded. "Good. I've sent word to the rest of the watchmen. They'll meet us at a safe house about 20 miles from here. From there, we can get this evidence to people who can use it, federal marshals. I trust newspaper editors, judges who can't be bought." Hayes looked at the children now gathered around Gabriel, who was speaking to them in low, reassuring tones. "What about them?" "They need medical attention, food safety." "The watchmen have a network," Mason assured him. "People who can care for them, hide them until Phoenix is exposed and dismantled." Hayes wasn't entirely convinced. "Phoenix has powerful backers, Mason. Reed made that clear. Even with the evidence we have, it won't be easy to bring them down." "Nothing worth doing ever is," the judge replied. "But with what you've uncovered, we have a real chance. For the first time in decades, Phoenix is vulnerable." Hayes hoped Mason was right. He glanced at Eleanor, who stood slightly apart from the group, her gaze fixed on the horizon, scanning for threats. The revelation about their connection, that they shared a mother, that Eleanor had been created using Sarah Hayes's DNA, hung between them unaddressed in the chaos of their escape. They would need to talk about it eventually. But for now, there were more immediate concerns: getting the children to safety, ensuring the evidence reached the right hands, staying ahead of Phoenix's reach until the organization could be exposed and dismantled. The personal revelations would have to wait. The safe house Mason had arranged was a former hunting lodge nestled deep in the forest, far from any main road or settlement. It was rustic but serviceable, a large main room with a stone fireplace, several bedrooms off to the sides, and a root cellar that could serve as a hiding place if necessary. By the time they arrived, dusk was falling, and the children were exhausted. Clara and Eleanor settled them in one of the bedrooms, making beds from blankets and spare clothing. Gabriel stayed with them, his presence a comfort to the younger children, who seemed to recognize him as one of their own. Hayes stood on the porch, rifle across his knees, keeping watch as darkness descended. Mason had left to meet his watchmen and guide them to the safe house, promising to return by midnight. Eleanor joined Hayes on the porch, carrying 2 cups of coffee. She handed one to him and sat on the rough-hewn bench beside him, her eyes scanning the darkness with the same vigilance as his. "The children are asleep," she said after a moment. "Clara gave them something to help them rest. They've been through a lot." Hayes nodded, sipping the hot coffee gratefully. "Gabriel seems to be good with them. He understands what they have experienced, what they're feeling." Eleanor's voice was soft, reflective. "Fear, confusion, the strange sense of loss, even though what they've lost was terrible. Phoenix becomes your world even when it's hurting you." Hayes studied her profile in the dim light spilling from the cabin windows. "Is that how it was for you when you escaped?" She nodded slowly. "Freedom is disorienting when you've never had it, when every minute of every day has been structured and controlled." A small smile touched her lips. "Your ranch was good for me. Simple work, clear purpose, but the freedom to choose how and when to do it." "You can come back," Hayes said quietly, "when this is over, if you want." Eleanor turned to look in and then her eyes searching his face. "After what we learned about Sarah Hayes, about what I am to you?" The question hung in the air between them, weighted with all the complexity of their situation. Hayes had been thinking about it since Clara's revelation, trying to reconcile the woman he had come to care for deeply with the knowledge that they shared a biological connection. "I don't know what you are to me," he said finally, honestly. "Sister seems too simple a word for it, too conventional for what Phoenix did." He set his coffee cup aside, choosing his words carefully. "But I know who you are to me. You're Eleanor, the woman who fixed my fences and gentled my wild stallion and made me feel like maybe the world wasn't as empty as I thought." Eleanor's expression softened, vulnerability showing through the composed exterior she usually maintained. "And you're Samuel Hayes, the man who saw me as a person when everyone else saw a weapon or a tool." She looked down at her hands strong and calloused from work. I don't know what we are to each other either. I just know I don't want to lose you because of what Phoenix did to create me. Hayes reached out hesitantly, covering one of her hands with his own. You won't, he promised. Whatever happens with Phoenix, whatever we discover about our connection, we'll figure it out. Together. Eleanor turned her hand over, gripping his with careful strength. They sat like that in companionable silence, watching the darkness, both aware that this moment of peace was likely to be short-lived. Phoenix would not give up easily. The fight was far from over. The sound of hooves approaching broke the quiet. Hayes stood rifle ready, while Eleanor moved silently to the side of the porch, positioning herself to intercept anyone who might try to enter the cabin. It's Mason, she said after a moment, her enhanced hearing allowing her to identify the rider before Hayes could see him. And others with him. 5. No 6 riders. Hayes relaxed slightly but remained vigilant. Mason had said he would bring trusted allies, but after what they had learned about Phoenix's reach, he wasn't taking any chances. The riders emerged from the trees, Mason in the lead, followed by men and women of various ages, all armed, all with the watchful demeanor of people accustomed to danger. They dismounted at the edge of the clearing, and Mason approached the porch alone, hands visible to show he was no threat. Samuel, he greeted Hayes. Eleanor, these are the watchmen I told you about. He gestured to the others who remained respectfully distant. People who have lost someone to Phoenix or who have discovered pieces of what they're doing. They've been working in secret for years, gathering information, trying to find proof. Hayes nodded to the group, noting the same mix of determination and grief in their faces that he had seen in Mason's. These were people who understood what was at stake, who had personal reasons to see Phoenix destroyed. Come inside, he said. We have a lot to discuss. The watchmen gathered in the main room of the cabin, speaking in hushed tones to avoid waking the children. Clara joined them, bringing the device containing the Phoenix files, which she connected to a small projector one of the watchmen had brought. Images flickered to life on the cabin wall, documents, diagrams, photographs of facilities and subjects. The evidence of Phoenix's decades-long program of abduction, experimentation, and conditioning laid bare for all to see. My God, one of the watchmen, a former marshal named Holloway, breathed as he studied the projected images. It's worse than we thought. The scale of it. They've been operating for at least 40 years, Clara confirmed. Started during the Civil War as a military research project, then went private when the government officially pulled funding. But they never really lost their military connections or their government backers. She scrolled to the list of names: politicians, generals, business leaders, all who had provided funding, protection, or resources to Phoenix over the years. Some of the names were shocking in their prominence and power. These people, another watchman, a newspaper editor named Simmons, shook his head in disbelief. They're untouchable. Senators, governors, industrialists. How do we bring them down? We don't have to bring all of them down, Mason said, just enough to expose Phoenix publicly. Once the story breaks, once people see what they've been doing to children, the others will distance themselves. Self-preservation is a powerful instinct. And we have these, Eleanor added, gesturing to the sleeping children in the next room. Living witnesses, proof of what Phoenix has done. The discussion continued late into the night, strategies debated, plans formed, and discarded, risks assessed. In the end, they settled on a multi-pronged approach. Simmons would prepare a comprehensive expose for his newspaper, with copies ready to send to every major publication in the country if anything happened to him. Holloway and 2 other former lawmen would take the evidence to federal marshals they trusted, bypassing local authorities who might be compromised. Mason would present the case to a federal judge he had served with during the war, a man known for his incorruptibility. And Hayes, Eleanor, and Clara would keep the children safe, moving them to a more secure location while the legal and public aspects of the plan unfolded. It will take time, Mason warned. Even with all this evidence, dismantling an organization as entrenched as Phoenix won't happen overnight. They'll fight back. They'll try to discredit us, silence us, eliminate us, if they can. Let them try, Eleanor said, her voice quiet but filled with determination. We're ready. As the meeting broke up, the watchmen departing to begin implementing their parts of the plan, Hayes found himself standing with Eleanor by the cabin's single window, watching the first hints of dawn breaking over the eastern mountains. Do you think it will work? He asked her. Eleanor considered the question, her face thoughtful in the pale light. I think it has to, she said finally. For Gabriel, for those children in there, for all the others still in Phoenix's control. She turned to face him fully. For us, so we can have that future you talked about at Stillwater Ranch. Hayes nodded, hope and determination mixing in equal measure. Then we'll make it work. The next few days passed in a blur of activity. They moved the children to a new safe house, a remote farmstead owned by one of the watchmen, where they would be protected by former soldiers, while the evidence against Phoenix was presented to the authorities. Clara worked tirelessly organizing the Phoenix files into a coherent narrative that would be irrefutable in court. Her medical knowledge allowed her to explain the technical aspects of the enhancements and conditioning in terms that lay people could understand and be appropriately horrified by. Eleanor focused on the children, especially the youngest girl, Rose, who had attached herself to Eleanor, with a desperate need of someone who had never known gentleness. Her patience and understanding with the traumatized children revealed a depth of compassion that moved Hayes deeply. And Hayes himself worked with Mason and the other watchmen, providing security, planning escape routes, preparing for Phoenix's inevitable counterattack. The organization had resources and reach that made them dangerous even as they were being exposed. Reports began to filter in. Simmons's expose had been published, causing a sensation across the country. Federal marshals had raided the Ashlock Ridge facility only to find it abandoned, but with enough evidence remaining to corroborate their claims. The federal judge had issued warrants for the arrests of Reed Vaughn and several other Phoenix leaders. But Phoenix wasn't going down without a fight. Two of the watchmen had been found dead under suspicious circumstances. Simmons had narrowly escaped an assassination attempt. And intelligence suggested that Reed was gathering a force to reclaim the children, the most damning evidence against Phoenix and valuable assets in their own right. "They're coming," Mason told Hayes grimly after returning from a meeting with his contacts. "Not just hired guns this time, enhanced subjects, older ones fully conditioned with the devices controlling them. Reed's personal guard." Hayes absorbed this news, his mind already calculating defenses, escape routes, contingencies. How many when? Unknown on the count, soon on the timing. Mason looked exhausted, the strain of the past days etched on his weathered face. "We need to move the children again. Somewhere they'll never think to look." Hayes nodded, already forming a plan. "I know a place, Stillwater Ranch. It's remote, defensible, and the last place they'd expect us to go, too obvious." Mason considered this. It could work, especially if we create a diversion, make them think we're headed somewhere else entirely. They set the plan in motion immediately. Half the remaining watchmen would take a decoy convoy north, making it appear that the children were being moved to a supposed safe house near the Canadian border. Meanwhile, Hayes, Eleanor, Clara, and the children would double back to Stillwater Ranch, traveling by night on little-used trails. The journey was tense, every shadow potentially concealing a Phoenix agent, every distant sound possibly signaling pursuit. The children, sensing the adults' anxiety, remained unnaturally quiet, huddled together in the wagon Clara drove. Gabriel, despite his youth, took on a protective role, helping with the smaller children, keeping watch when the adults needed to rest. They reached Stillwater Ranch on the third night, the familiar silhouette of the buildings a welcome sight to Hayes after their long absence. Everything was as they had left it, the house undisturbed, the livestock in the far pasture healthy, if somewhat thin, the wild stallion. Eleanor had gentled, pacing restlessly in the corral as if sensing their return. "Home," Eleanor said softly as they approached, the word carrying a weight of meaning Hayes felt in his own chest. They settled the children in the main house, converting the living room into a dormitory of sorts with improvised beds. Clara tended to those who needed medical attention, which was thankfully minimal after their time at the previous safe house. For the next 2 days, they established a routine, Hayes and Eleanor taking turns on watch, Clara caring for the children, Gabriel helping wherever he could. They received occasional messages from Mason via a trusted courier. Updates on the case against Phoenix, more raids, more arrests, more evidence uncovered. The organization was crumbling, its secrets exposed to the light. But Reed remained at large, and the threat he posed loomed over them like a storm cloud on the horizon. On the third night, Eleanor took the watch, positioning herself on the roof of the barn where she had a clear view of the surrounding landscape. Hayes checked on the children, finding them all asleep except for Gabriel, who sat by the window, his own vigilance undiminished. "You should rest," Hayes told him, gently. "We've got the watch." Gabriel shook his head. "I can feel them," he said, his voice low and tense. "They're coming." Not close yet, but coming. Hayes knew better than to doubt the boy's enhanced senses. How many? How far? I don't know exactly. Several, maybe a day away. Gabriel looked up at him, his young face solemn. Reed is with them. I can feel his signature. It's different from the others. Hayes nodded, accepting this intelligence as he would any scout's report. Thank you, Gabriel. Try to rest if you can. We'll need everyone at their best. He left the house and crossed the yard to the barn, climbing the ladder to the roof where Eleanor maintained her watch. She turned at his approach, her enhanced hearing having detected him long before he reached her. Gabriel says they're coming, Hayes said without preamble. A day out, maybe less. Reed is with them. Eleanor nodded, unsurprised. I've been feeling it too. A pressure like before a storm. She gestured to the quiet landscape around them. This peace couldn't last. Hayes settled beside her, his rifle across his knees. No, he agreed, but it's worth fighting for. They sat in silence for a time, watching the stars wheel overhead, each lost in their own thoughts, yet somehow together in them as well. Finally, Eleanor spoke, her voice soft in the night. Whatever happens tomorrow or the next day when they come, I want you to know something. She turned to face him, her expression more open than he had ever seen it. Finding you coming here, it saved me. Not just from Phoenix, but from myself, from believing I was nothing but what they made me. Hayes felt a tightness in his throat, emotions he usually kept carefully contained threatening to overwhelm him. You saved me too, he said simply. After Nathaniel died, I was just existing, not living. You changed that. Eleanor smiled, a rare full smile that transformed her face. Then, regardless of what Phoenix intended, something good came from their experiments after all. Hayes returned her smile, finding comfort in the thought. They had both been shaped by forces beyond their control, war loss, Phoenix's manipulations, yet here they were choosing their own path, fighting for a future neither of them had dared imagine before. The next day was spent in preparation. Hayes reinforced the defenses around the ranch boarding windows, creating firing positions, establishing fallback points. Eleanor worked with Gabriel, using his sensitivity to approaching threats to set up an early warning system. Clara prepared medical supplies and made sure the children understood what to do if fighting broke out. By evening, everything that could be done had been done. They gathered in the main house for a simple meal, the atmosphere subdued but not defeated. After the children were settled for the night, Hayes, Eleanor, Clara, and Gabriel convened around the kitchen table, going over their plans one final time. If they come in force, we won't be able to hold them off indefinitely. Hayes said, his tactical assessment blunt but necessary. Our priority is keeping the children safe. If it looks like we're going to be overrun, we take them through the escape tunnel to the cave in the North Ridge. The tunnel had been Nathaniel's creation, a precaution from the days when Indian raids were still a concern, connecting the house's root cellar to a cave system that ran through the nearby hills. Hayes had maintained it over the years, more out of respect for his brother's foresight than any expectation of using it. And if we get separated, Clara asked. We meet at Judge Mason's line shack, Hayes replied. Anyone who can't make it there should try to reach federal authorities. With the evidence already public, Phoenix can't silence everyone. They reviewed contingencies, escape routes, signals they would use to communicate in the chaos of battle. When everything had been covered, Hayes stood, his decision made. Try to get some rest, he told the others. I'll take first watch. As they dispersed, Eleanor lingered, her eyes meeting his with an unspoken question. Hayes nodded slightly, and she followed him onto the porch, closing the door behind them. For a moment, they stood in silence, the night around them, alive with the ordinary sounds of the ranch horses in the barn, wind in the grass, an owl calling from a distant tree. Sounds of peace that might soon be shattered. I've been thinking, Hayes said finally, about what happens after. If we survive this, if Phoenix is destroyed, what then? Eleanor leaned against the porch railing, her face thoughtful in the moonlight. I don't know, she admitted. I never planned beyond escaping. Never let myself imagine a future. I have, Hayes said quietly, a future here, at Stillwater, with you if you want it, and Gabriel and the others if they have nowhere else to go. Eleanor looked at him, her expression a mix of hope and uncertainty. Hey, what your sister, your, what? Hayes chose his words carefully, knowing their importance. As Eleanor, just Eleanor. Whatever that means to you, to me, to us. We don't have to define it by conventional terms or by what Phoenix did. He moved closer, not touching her, but close enough that he could if he reached out. I care for you. That hasn't changed because of what we learned about Sarah Hayes. Eleanor was silent for a long moment, processing his words. Then slowly she nodded. I'd like that, she said softly. A future here, with you, figuring it out as we go. Hayes felt something tight in his chest ease a tension he hadn't fully acknowledged until it released. Then that's what we'll fight for, he said, not just against Phoenix, but for what comes after. Eleanor's hand found his in the darkness, strong fingers intertwining with his own. They stood together in the quiet night, two people who had found each other against all odds, determined to hold on to what they had built, despite the forces arrayed against them. The attack came at dawn as Hayes had expected. Not a frontal assault, but a coordinated approach from multiple directions, figures moving through the morning mist with unnatural coordination and purpose. Enhanced subjects, just as Mason had warned, controlled by the devices Phoenix had perfected. Hayes spotted them from his position on the porch and gave the alarm a series of short whistles that carried across the ranch yard. Eleanor emerged from the barn, where she had been checking the horses, Gabriel from the bunkhouse, where he had insisted on sleeping, Clara from the main house where she had been with the children. North and east, Hayes called to Eleanor, who nodded and moved to take up her assigned position near the corral. At least 8 that I can see. Gabriel closed his eyes briefly, his face concentrating. 12, he corrected. And something else. Something different. Hayes didn't have time to ask what the boy meant. The first of the enhanced subjects broke from the cover of the trees, moving with the inhuman speed that marked Phoenix's most successful experiments. Eleanor intercepted him, her own enhanced strength and speed, making her a formidable opponent despite the man's conditioning. Hayes raised his rifle and fired, aiming for the legs of another subject approaching from the east. The shot hit its mark, but the man barely faltered, the pain suppressed by the device controlling him. It took a second shot, this one to the shoulder, to finally bring him down. Clara had gathered the children in the main house, ready to lead them to the escape tunnel if the perimeter was breached. Gabriel remained near Hayes, his enhanced senses providing warning of new threats. Behind the barn, he said suddenly. 2 more. Hayes turned, spotting the figures Gabriel had sensed. He fired, dropping one, but the other reached the barn before he could adjust his aim. Eleanor, having dispatched her opponent, moved to intercept. The battle continued, a desperate defense against foes who felt no pain, who kept coming despite injuries that would have stopped a normal person. Hayes and Eleanor managed to hold them off, but Hayes could see that the attack was coordinated, designed to probe their defenses and find weaknesses. And then he saw him, Harrison Reed, standing at the edge of the trees, observing the battle with clinical detachment. Beside him was a figure Hayes didn't immediately recognize, a woman in a Phoenix uniform, but with an odd blank expression that suggested she too was under the influence of a control device. Eleanor, Hayes called, pointing toward Reed. 9 o'clock. Eleanor followed his gesture, her body tensing as she spotted their true enemy. Without hesitation, she began moving toward Reed, dispatching another enhanced subject who tried to block her path. Hayes provided covering fire, keeping the remaining attackers at bay as Eleanor closed the distance to Reed. The Phoenix director remained calm, watching her approach with an almost curious expression. When Eleanor was about 20 yards away, Reed raised his hand, holding what appeared to be a small control device. He pressed a button, and the woman beside him moved forward with inhuman speed, intercepting Eleanor's charge. The 2 enhanced women collided with a force that would have killed ordinary humans, the impact sending them both tumbling across the ground. They rose almost immediately, circling each other with predatory grace. Hayes tried to get a clear shot at Reed, but the director had positioned himself carefully, using trees and the controlled woman as shields. Frustrated, Hayes turned his attention back to defending the house, trusting Eleanor to handle Reed. The fight between Eleanor and the controlled woman was unlike anything Hayes had ever seen. 2 enhanced humans moving faster than seemed possible, striking with forces that shattered wood and dented metal when they missed their targets. The controlled woman fought with mechanical precision, every move calculated and efficient. Eleanor fought with the same skill, but with something the other woman lacked: innovation, adaptation, the human ability to improvise. Reed watched the battle with evident interest, occasionally adjusting settings on his control device, which seemed to alter the controlled woman's fighting style or speed. It was, Hayes realized with disgust, an experiment to him, a test of his controlled subject against one who had broken free. Gabriel had remained near the house, helping Clara prepare the children for possible evacuation. But now he moved to Hayes's side, his young face set in determined lines. "I can help," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. "With Reed, I know how the control device works." Hayes hesitated, unwilling to put the boy in danger. But Gabriel's enhanced senses and knowledge of Phoenix technology might be their best chance to end this fight. "Stay low," he instructed. "Follow me." Together they moved around the edge of the battle, using the distraction of the ongoing fights to approach Reed from the side. The Phoenix director focused on the battle between Eleanor and his controlled subject, didn't notice their approach until they were almost upon him. Reed turned surprise, briefly crossing his face before his usual composure returned. "Subject 17D, he said, addressing Gabriel. "Coming back to where you belong. Wise decision." "I belong here," Gabriel replied, his voice unwavering. "With people who see me as a person, not a thing." Reed smiled thinly. "You are a thing, 17D, a very valuable, very expensive thing that Phoenix created." He gestured to the battles raging across the ranch yard. "Look at what your friends have caused. All this destruction, all this waste. And for what? You can't escape what you are. What we made you." "Maybe not," Gabriel conceded, "but I can choose what I do with it." With surprising speed, he darted forward, not toward Reed, but toward the control device in his hand. Reed reacted quickly, stepping back and raising the device out of Gabriel's reach. But the movement was exactly what Hayes had been waiting for. With Reed momentarily distracted and out of position, Hayes had a clear shot. He fired his bullet, striking the control device, shattering it in Reed's hand. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The controlled woman fighting Eleanor suddenly stopped, her body going rigid for a moment before collapsing to the ground. Around the ranch yard, the other enhanced subjects similarly faltered, the coordinated attack dissolving into confusion as the devices controlling them ceased functioning. Reed stared at his bleeding hand in shock, then at Hayes with a mixture of disbelief and fury. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" he demanded. "Those subjects will die without the device maintaining their neural functions. Years of work, millions in investment gone." "Good," Hayes said, simply keeping his rifle trained on Reed. "No one should have that kind of power over another person." Eleanor approached her, clothing torn and bloody, but her movements still strong and sure. She had survived her battle with a controlled woman who now lay unconscious but breathing on the ground nearby. "It's over, Reed," she said. "Phoenix is exposed, your facilities raided, your backers deserting you, and now your weapons neutralized." Reed's composure cracked, his face contorting with rage. "Nothing is over," he spat. "Phoenix is more than facilities, more than backers. It's an idea, a vision for humanity's future. You can't kill an idea." "No," Eleanor agreed, "but we can make sure yours never becomes reality." With a movement too fast for Hayes to track, she closed the distance to Reed and delivered a precise blow to his temple, not enough to kill, but enough to render him unconscious. He crumpled to the ground, his expression of rage frozen on his face. In the sudden quiet that followed, Hayes became aware of the aftermath of battle around them, enhanced subjects lying wounded or unconscious across the ranch yard, the smell of gunpowder hanging in the air, the distant sound of horses whinnying nervously in the barn. "Is it really over?" Gabriel asked, looking from the fallen Reed to Eleanor. Eleanor knelt beside Reed, checking to make sure he was securely unconscious. "This part," she said. "The rest, making sure Phoenix can never rebuild, finding and helping all the subjects they created, building new lives for ourselves, that's just beginning." Hayes moved to join them, his rifle still at the ready, but his posture relaxing slightly. "Mason's federal contacts should be here by nightfall," he said. "They'll take Reed into custody along with the other Phoenix subjects. Get them medical attention, proper evaluation." Eleanor nodded, rising to her feet. "And the children?" "They can stay here," Hayes said without hesitation. "All of them, for as long as they need, until we find their families if possible, or indefinitely if not." Gabriel looked up at Hayes, hope warring with caution in his young face. "Really, we can stay." Hayes nodded, something warm unfurling in his chest at the boy's expression. "Really, this is your home now, if you want it to be." Eleanor's eyes met his over Gabriel's head, a similar hope visible in their gray depths. "All of us," she asked softly. "All of you," Hayes confirmed. "Family isn't just blood, it's choice. And I choose all of you." The word hung in the air between them, family. Not defined by conventional relationships or biological connections, but by shared experiences, mutual respect, and the decision to stand by each other, despite everything Phoenix had done to twist and pervert those connections. Clara emerged from the house, the other children clustered behind her, their faces a mixture of fear and hope as they took in the aftermath of the battle. "Is it safe?" she asked. Hayes nodded. "It's safe. We won." As Clara led the children across the yard, as Gabriel ran to meet them, as the first rays of the rising sun touched the buildings of Stillwater Ranch, Hayes felt Eleanor's hand slip into his own. He glanced at her, finding a peace in her expression he had never seen before, the look of someone who had fought a long, terrible battle and finally won. "What now?" she asked, her voice soft enough that only he could hear. Hayes looked out at the ranch, at the land that had been his sanctuary, his prison, and now might become something else entirely, a home for people who had never had one, a place of healing for those who had been wounded in ways most couldn't comprehend. "Now," he said, squeezing her hand gently, "we live." 6 months later, Stillwater Ranch was transformed. The bunkhouse had been expanded into a proper dormitory for the children, who had stayed 5 in all, including Gabriel, whose leadership abilities had only grown as he settled into his new role as the oldest of their unconventional family. Clara had converted one of the outbuildings into a small clinic and laboratory where she continued her research, not to enhance or control, but to understand and help those Phoenix had already altered. Her work was gaining attention in medical circles, carefully anonymized to protect the children's identities, but potentially groundbreaking in treating neurological conditions. Eleanor had taken to ranching with the same quiet competence she brought to everything. The wild stallion was now fully gentled, responding to her commands with willing partnership rather than fearful obedience. She had taught the children to ride, to care for animals, to find joy in physical work that served a purpose beyond Phoenix's cruel experiments. And Hayes had found himself changed in ways he hadn't expected. The solitude he had once craved now seemed empty compared to the bustling life of the ranch. The grief that had consumed him after Nathaniel's death hadn't disappeared, but it had transformed into something constructive, a determination to give these children the safety and respect his brother had died trying to secure for them. Phoenix was gone, its facilities shuttered, its leaders imprisoned or in hiding, its files made public in a scandal that had rocked the highest levels of government and military. There were still enhanced subjects unaccounted for, still former Phoenix scientists who had escaped justice, still the lingering fear that something like Phoenix might rise again from the ashes of the original. But for now, there was peace, there was purpose, there was improbably family. As the sun set on another day, Hayes stood on the porch watching Eleanor teach Rose, the youngest of their charges, how to groom a pony in the corral. The girl's laughter floated across the yard, a sound that would have been unimaginable during her time at Phoenix. Clara joined him on the porch, a cup of coffee in her hands, her expression thoughtful as she followed his gaze. "She's good with them," she observed. "With all of them?" Hayes nodded. "She understands them, what they've been through, what they need." Clara sipped her coffee, considering her next words carefully. "You know my mother, Sarah, she would be proud of both of you. This is what she wanted in the end. For her research to help people, not control them. For the children Phoenix created to have real lives, real choices." Hayes had come to terms with the truth about Sarah Hayes over the months since Clara's revelation. Not fully, perhaps. The deception ran too deep, the lost years too numerous for complete acceptance, but enough to acknowledge her as part of his past and Eleanor's too. "I hope so," he said simply. Clara smiled slightly. "I know so. I found more of her journals after the raids. She wrote about you, about Nathaniel. She regretted leaving even if she believed her work was important." She paused. "She would be especially proud of what you and Eleanor have built here. A real home for these children. A place where they can just be children." Hayes watched as Eleanor lifted Rose onto the pony's back, holding her securely while the girl squealed with delight. Gabriel appeared from the barn, leading another horse, his movements confident and easy, in a way they hadn't been when he first arrived at the ranch. "We're still figuring it out," Hayes admitted. "What we are to each other, what this place is becoming." "That's what family is," Clara said softly, "constantly evolving, adapting, choosing each other every day despite the complications." She set her empty cup on the porch railing. "I should check on James. His headaches are better, but he still needs monitoring. As she went back inside, Hayes remained on the porch watching the scene in the corral. Eleanor looked up, sensing his gaze, perhaps, and smiled a full, unguarded smile that transformed her face and sent a warmth through Hayes's chest that had nothing to do with the evening sun. They were still working out what they were to each other. Not conventional siblings, not conventional anything. But they were family in all the ways that mattered. They had chosen each other and continued to choose each other every day, building something neither of them had dared to imagine during their darkest times. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and purple. Another day ending, another beginning on the horizon. For Hayes, for Eleanor, for all of them at Stillwater Ranch, each sunset brought not darkness, but the promise of a new dawn, a future they would create together free from Phoenix's shadow, defined not by what had been done to them, but by what they chose to do with the lives they had reclaimed. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't easy, but it was theirs, and that made all the difference.